History Untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back live, coming to you from across the divided states of America, the most disruptive show in these divided states on the West Coast and in the politically independent corner. I am your investigative political analyst and radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
And in the East Coast and in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas, who is 43 today, getting ancient.
And together we are Fault Line with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're getting into it. Just as we do every morning we're airing the show, we come to you with three sets of headlines, one at 7, one at 8, and one at 9 a.m. in the morning. That's East Coast time, of course. Let's get straight into it. After this first batch, by the way, we're going into tomorrow's monologue, and then we're taking calls. But without further ado, in the news, a right-wing protester in Portland was killed on Saturday, triggering the latest escalation of political violence in the U.S. This follows the arrival of a caravan of about 600 vehicles into Portland on Saturday. They were part of a right-wing group called Patriot Prayer. On Sunday, Trump criticized Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler for his response, his handling of the protests over recent months. And at a press conference, Wheeler angrily pushed back, warning those considering visiting Portland to, quote, seek retribution, end quote, to stay away, saying that now is, quote, not the time to get hot-headed because you read something on Twitter that some guy made up in his mother's basement, end quote. Aaron J. Danielson was shot and killed. He's a member of Patriot Prayer, and he was killed by Michael Reinhold, an Antifa activist who had written a manifesto on Instagram about being, quote, ready to fight. Big story there. Yeah, we'll come back to that, undoubtedly talk about that. In related news, sort of, Trump is planning a visit to Kenosha, Wisconsin tomorrow. This follows over a week of protests since the shooting of Jacob Blake and a consequent wave of protests and riots in the city. Yesterday, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers wrote a letter to Trump telling the president he should not visit Kenosha, saying he's concerned that Trump's presence would, quote, only hinder our healing, end quote. In response, White House spokesperson Judd Deere wrote that the, quote, White House has been humbled by the outreach of individuals from Kenosha who have welcomed the president's visit and are longing for leadership to support local law enforcement and businesses that have been vandalized. President Trump looks forward to visiting on Tuesday and helping this great city heal and rebuild, end quote. Again, more to talk about there after headlines. On Saturday, California's state Senate passed a measure to set up a 9-member commission to conduct a detailed study of the impact of slavery in California and recommend to the legislature by July 2023 the form of compensation to be awarded, how it should be delivered, and who should be eligible to receive it. We're talking about reparations here. Democratic Senator Holly Mitchell said, quote, let's be clear. Chattel slavery, or chattel slavery, both in California and across our nation, birthed a legacy of racial harm and inequity that continues to impact the conditions of Black life in California, end quote. In our next headline, and internationally, moving to the globe, Turkey started military exercises on Saturday in an eastern Mediterranean standoff with Greece, while Greece is planning its own rival Navy exercises with France, Cyprus, and Italy. This recent conflict began when a Turkish seismic vessel ventured inside of Greece's coastal waters with warships to do petrochemical exploration. That happened earlier on in August. It was south of the small island of Castellarizo. This caused Greece to try to reassert and expand its nautical jurisdiction. Then on Tuesday, Greece's foreign minister Nikos Dendias accused Erdogan of advancing a, quote, neo-Ottoman strategy, end quote, in the Eastern Mediterranean as part of a, quote, attempt to implement expansionist aims against neighbors and allies, end quote. In our next headline, also in that region, a little bit further east and south, President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will be boarding the first commercial flight from Israel to the United Arab Emirates today, following an announcement he made yesterday alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien that, quote, the stage is set, end quote, for Israel and other Arab countries in the region to create stronger ties and, quote, previously unthinkable, end quote, economic, security, and religious cooperation. On Saturday, the UAE formally ended its commercial boycott of Israel, although the two countries have in fact quietly conducted business for years. Monday's flight of an El Al plane from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi will be the first known flight of an Israeli commercial airliner from Israel to the Emirates. And the two Mideast countries are expected to sign a formal agreement at the White House in the coming weeks. In our next headline, the Israeli military struck targets in Gaza with tank fire early yesterday morning. This follows weeks of incendiary balloons launched from Palestine into Israel, which have caused fires in fields and farmland. In response, Israel has also closed Gaza's sole commercial crossing, leaving Gazans with only a few hours of electricity a day, while also preventing fishing along the territory's coast. This also comes as authorities in Gaza reported the first cases there of local transmission of the coronavirus. And in my last headline this morning, there were riots in the city of Malmö in Sweden after far-right activists in the country burned and kicked Korans near a predominantly migrant neighborhood. More than 3 people gathered to protest and riot there. Again, arsons and rioting across the city. That's the news. Those are the headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Jamarl, what's on your mind? What are you talking about today?
I want to talk about voter shaming. We're going to see a lot of that in the next coming, the next, X number of months until the election takes place. I'm enamored by voter shaming, if I'm being very honest. And the fact that they call it shaming means to some degree that people accept the fact of being shamed in this kind of weird way. But on top of that, the notion of privilege in context of that. So, and more importantly, who is actually being privileged by our political system? So I've said on more than one occasion, I think I've even said it on the show, I don't have a dog in the hunt regarding the presidential election. My litmus test, going back for several months, has been Medicare for all. That litmus test hasn't changed. The policy is in the best interest of myself. It's in the best interest of America, for God's sakes. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're talking like 40 million people that don't have health insurance. That's astonishing. That's astonishing. A, that we allow that in a pandemic. But B, that neither political party takes it seriously. Joe Biden has talked about pulling back, saying that, yeah, we said we're going to get the public option and stuff, but, we're just going to pull back on that. We're going to tweak Obamacare. You've been had. But the catch is, you don't care now, because it's Trump versus Biden. And you're going to get 70% of the people who voted for Joe Biden are voting for Joe Biden because his name is not Donald Trump, not for any affirmative message. That's sad. That's utterly sad. A guy on Twitter came to me and said, this is an example of privilege. And I made the point to him, I know that he walked away from that thinking, God, I wish he was white, so I could scream white privilege at that at the voting thing, adding a racial element to the fact that I have chosen that it is not in my best interest to perpetuate this nonsense that the Democratic Party is in any way there to ameliorate any of the changes. And it is Biden's responsibility to get my vote, not the other way around. Not only does voter shaming not work, as it experientially clear from Clinton's election, where she lost to Donald Trump, because as a flat fact, whatever you want to think about it, however you feel about it, Donald Trump is your president right now, president of the United States, in the White House, feet on the desk. That's your guy. And by the way, could win this election right now because Joe Biden, in the recent polling, is running neck to neck. I mean, if you look back at the Clinton race, Clinton had, a 4-point lead? And if you look back now at Biden's race in battleground states, he only has a 2 or 3-point lead. It's that close, regardless of what you're saying about the polling. This is an electoral college. We choose these things in battleground states. Yeah, Joe Biden could lose this race. How weird is it that people believe the party to which they're ascribed and the candidates to which they support have zero responsibility in representing the interests of not just their party, but also America? I could go down the list of policies. All of them are popular. None of them are supported by Joe Biden and the party. And instead of this barnacle going out there and screaming at their candidates, how are you not organically bringing the party together by representing Medicare for all and expansion of Social Security and the elimination of student debt and et cetera, $15 minimum wage, things that would ameliorate the problems and the defects that we are currently experiencing in our population right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And you're talking about all of these people who don't have jobs, all of these people being thrown out of their homes, all of these people who are dying or will die by Christmas, all of these people who are infected, which means medical bills that they're going to be eaten alive by. And the best that Joe Biden can do is have these type of creatures out there screaming at other people, vote for the guy that is not representative of any of this stuff. As if lefties are somehow going to magically get what they want regarding policy by voting for somebody that in no way represents those ideas. And not just not represent those ideas. This is not representing those ideas at a time of multiple crises. Centricity, as they call it. Radical centrists. Which is obscene, considering where we are. I am making the very basic point. I'm asking a very basic question. Is it Joe Biden's responsibility to go to those people and appropriate various policies that would organically bring the party together to beat a man that they are calling the apocalypse? And if Joe Biden doesn't do that, what does it mean for representative government? By the way, the very fact that this guy's out there screaming at that inverts the entire process of representative government, meaning he's not coming to represent your interests. You're just so terrified, you're clinging to him. That's obscene. That's an inversion of the way politics is supposed to work. I don't care if Satan himself is on the other side of the dispatch box. It doesn't get rid of the responsibility of the candidate to deal with the actual material concerns of the population. How do you have a policy with 88% Democratic support and he tells you kick rocks and you believe that you're in some level of a representative government when a candidate can do that and still expect your vote? I'm saying that's obscene. The issue of privilege here is not an issue of somebody being wealthy. In fact, it's the opposite. I've made this point before. Washington Post summary that surveys Pew shows almost half of non-voters are non-white, 2/3 are under the age of 50. More than half of those who didn't earn or who didn't vote earned it less than $30,000 a year. I'm making the point to you that the majority of people who don't vote are African American or people of color and poor. These would be demographics for the Democratic Party. But the catch here is those people stop voting because they realize rationally that the energy they put into it did not come back from the context of material gains for them. And just like they have right here, two beauty pageants where one screams least worse and the other ones use other characteristics to get votes, it's scammed. It's rigged. Those rational people understood that. And those were people who were at the hardest edges of the economic system. If you want to go and talk about privilege, if you go to Kenosha, Wisconsin right now, 39.4% poverty rate for blacks. 39.4%. That's astonishing. That's people who are dirt poor, who are in absolute violence of poverty, not being able to make their ends meet, dying at younger ages and all of this other stuff. You have, for whites, 13%. If you ask the question, how many communities or how many neighborhoods in Wisconsin are black? Well, the majority are in prisons or jails. That's astonishing. Even if you go to unemployment, that number is like 3 to 4 times higher for blacks than whites. I'm making a point to you that Wisconsin has what? A Democratic governor, Democratic mayor, in Kenosha. And these are the conditions to which they find themselves. And yeah, why are you going to be shocked that people who are living in conditions like that, who recognize that those conditions are unfair, why are you going to be shocked for the explosion? Now, the point that I'm making here, though, is what's privilege in this situation? To persist with Democrats that persist situations like are in Wisconsin, or pick anywhere around the world, or from the standpoint of the states that is indebted and where they are having issues of, let's say, police violence. Choosing a Democrat doesn't change that. Choosing Biden doesn't change that. It is a rational choice to say, I am not going to perpetuate a system that does this. Because whether those people for the last 40 years have voted for Democrats or voted for Republicans, at the end of the day, choosing a Democrat did not ameliorate those situations. What's privilege in this situation? To shame people and to try to get those people to vote for a candidate that is going to persist those situations. Or to stand in a position that says it is their job to represent my interests. And in order for that to take place, tens of millions of people are going to have to extricate themselves from the political space and assert their demands. If the Democratic Party wants to tank it to a man they're calling the apocalypse, then they need to explain that. And not just they need to explain it, you need to come to some rationalization that you no longer live in a representative government. That's my basic point. Kenosha was Kenosha, whether people voted Democrat or Republican. And choose any of these places that are ensconced in poverty, that are ensconced in violence. They were and are that way, whether you voted for Democrat or Republican. Voting for the Democrat didn't ameliorate that. And that didn't take place entirely in the interest of Trump. Let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert, and we're doubling down.
Yeah, we're doubling down on crazy. We're doubling down on our new show called Double Down on Sputnik. It's doubling down on absolute joyous radio nirvana. You will love it. You will want to listen to every single episode on Sputnik. Bye, y'all.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. And I'm going to respond briefly to Jamarl's monologue. Jamarl, you were talking about voter shaming, talking about, in general, this is pretty much, I'd say, other than Medicare, this might be your main issue. This issue of, you're talking to lefties as a lefty on the issue of voting for the Democrats or not, following Bernie. I can sympathize with you on that base political level, but for me, it's always do something else, do something outside of the existing political system, because it's caught in its own gridlock. And I think the only real alternative here is for you to create your own change outside of it. That's where I start and sort of where I end. And maybe that's my naivete, or maybe that's just my bias, but that's my take on it. And that's really all I have to say to that. We are taking calls though, 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif on the line. Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I got two comments, and my last comment is dealing with Elon Musk with the Neuralink, but my first comment is dealing with the Department of Energy learned how to turn carbon dioxide into liquid fuel by using a catalyst of copper and carbon. And it says the beginning stages of using carbon dioxide in other processes too. So I got the it's from Popular Mechanics, and I put that link to y'all tweet for today. And also I put the link up for Elon Musk dealing with Neuralinks when he talking for an hour and 13 minutes talking about Neuralinks. He was talking about how it can deal with hearing loss, blindness, paralyzations, brain damage, Alzheimer's, dementia, which is a good thing, and I think it would be good to start, helping out people with that. But I think some laws are going to have to be passed, some regulations to protect people's minds, people's thoughts, people's bodies from being hacked. And also, with these electrodes being placed in your brain, basically eroding away, causing other effects, other problems, So we need laws, and I hope Ryan Paul is listening, but I know he ain't listening. But we need laws to protect us, protect our thoughts, so we won't become somebody else puppet. You know what I'm saying? Well, mind control, MK Ultra. So yeah,
Tarif,
that's all I want.
It's a slippery slope. Mm-hmm. The moment that I predicted months ago, I think it was maybe a month or so, a year ago, when we were talking about this kind of brain technology, and I said the way they're going to introduce it is illness. This affects this person's blindness. This affects this person's something else. And what's going to take place is they're going to say, oh, by the way, there has this extra benefit that this person can hold additional information. This person can concentrate longer. This person can do X or Y. And other people are going to get involved with, okay, maybe I want one of those. Meaning the transition between illness and healthy people is going to be one where you find an advantage in having it versus not. And then it's going to be certain jobs that people are going to have it because of the interface. As they expand it, the capabilities of it are going to expand also. Like, it's a slippery slope. It's like the moment that you do it, you do it. And one more point. There is no or law that can affect or protect your brain. Laws aren't real. That technology would be made of real material conditions that is infecting or investing itself in your brain. You would not even know at that point whether it was infecting your brain or not, because your perspective of reality wouldn't be able to judge itself as being off. It would just be real to you. Like, whatever law they pass, you realize whatever militaries or other countries are going to use militaristic applications to try to get in control of people, etc. I don't know how you protect people from that. I think it runs.
This is the fake news issue. This is also sort of like the who watches the Watchmen issue on that fundamental philosophical level. But you can also see it as the issue of fake news. If you like a lot of people on the right, but just in general, a lot of people in sort of modern society in America are pushing back against stories they see being propagated widely that they see as being untrue in different ways. You just take Wikipedia as an example, as this sort of the key model or key example for understanding this. Wikipedia is based on verifiable sources, but it's based on verifiable sources from the establishment, from a certain subset of sort of prestigious, respected institutions. And what happens is that even if there's a sort of standout story from one of those institutions, if there's dead silence from the others on a given story, it's not going to get covered. And true facts about it get obscured, and false facts, if they're reported by the establishment, are preserved. And of course, they come to represent the story. So you get, if the establishment itself is wrong, if on that highest level, it's telling something that's untrue, like you're saying, that there's no way to repair that. You can't do that by the fiat of a law if the mechanism by which you're enforcing that law is also going to be wrong. It's that same issue. But one other, you sort of just kept talking about it in the context of Neuralink, that specific technology. The way I see it, though, is we kind of are already in that space. I mean, we have been for as long, in some deep sense, as long as we've generated media, as long as we've most of our interactions, or more of our interactions increasingly, have been mediated by technological media, by if you think about in-person speech, that's like the everything that follows that is some form of media that mediates communication. And historically, those have almost always, what gets said, what gets spread, what gets preserved, that's almost always been related to who is in control of the reins of power at any given point. And we're seeing the increase of that. If you look at, through the internet, through the increasing prevalence of more and more kinds of media, what is multimedia if not the increasing extent of these different types with VR and AR and everything online, it's everything. The difference with Neuralink, of course, is the throughput, the bandwidth, the actual connection, you sort of blow that bottleneck wide open. If you're no longer having to tap with your fingers on a smartphone or whatever it is that's actually connecting you to your device, if you have that direct connection with your brain, that's where it gets, I think, deeply scary. But my point is just, in some sense, we're already living in that manicured, curated environment that
but what reality is.
We're already stuck inside of it.
That's the difference. Like, you can make an appraisal on your reality, like from here, even though you might be getting hit with a ton of information. You can still try to work your way through, okay, this is what I believe in, this is what, and try to get to a point. The moment that it's in your head, there is your appraisal of reality. You can't make an adjustment for it. Like, how do you know what's real when the thing that's telling you what's real is basically telling you something that's wrong? It's like if somebody had a delusion or something. You could have, honestly, you could think that there was an alien attack, and that could just be you, the only one that's thinking it. Like, I'm trying to make the point that your appraisal of reality itself becomes in question.
I think that's where we are now, though. That's the thing. I think, again, it's this. I don't want to say this wouldn't be a categorical jump. Something like a Neuralink would be huge and unprecedented in scary ways. But my point is, we're already, just specifically with what you were just saying, we're already living in a sort of media curated reality. We're definitely already there completely. There's a lot of all the stuff that you and I are talking about, we don't take it in by direct sensory experience. There are deep fakes. Every single thing that we're talking about is mediated by this vast machine, And so my point is, I'm not getting conspiratorial with this. I'm just saying, functionally, you could get conspiratorial, but functionally, everything is driven by the interests, the mandates of the system that shares this stuff. But we've got Eric in Texas. I'll let you get your word in, of course, but maybe we should go to Eric in Texas right away.
Yeah, Eric in Texas. Eric, you here?
Jawohl. This is the Hans-Erik Wilhelm von Grubenschleider for the 10. We are for the thousands, but not the Hitler and the Merkel now. It's only for the 10. We have a deal for the century better than was son-in-law for the Trump. Jawohl. We have the reparations for Syria and Lebanon. We want for the Golan Heights. We asked for President Putin. We want for the S-700 missile defense system to be deployed there. Jawohl. This way, Israel will not need for the nuclear weapons. If we can make for this deal, maybe Jerusalem will not have to be rebuilt. Jawohl. Fault lines. Jawohl.
Interesting take. I like the impression. Thank you for the call, Eric in Texas. You're talking about, I guess, a different way potentially denuclearizing Israel. I'll be honest, a little bit of this, it was a little bit hard to make some of that out. I only started to piece it together towards the end when the individual words started to stick out. I don't know. Jamarl, what's your take?
I could not understand anything he said, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
I heard something about missiles.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I heard. Missile defense. So yeah, I don't know. It's something about Israel being
rebuilt. That's a bit tricky.
But otherwise, I have no idea.
Eric, thank you for the call. Last time you called in, that was pretty funny. This time, it was hard to hear what you were actually saying. That's the only problem in this case. But I appreciate the earnestness. And again, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320.
Keep talking.
Shane?
Yeah, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Trying to get somebody on. We were supposed to have Tom Luong go on. He's dropping out at 9:30, trying to figure somebody else for that slot. I don't know.
What I want to talk about is Ingrid. Ingrid, one of our callers. She calls all the time, and I appreciate her calls. And Ingrid pointed to me and said, hey, it's not murder, and the guy is going to get off. It's murder now, Ingrid. So homicide charges have been announced against Kyle Rittenhouse, accused of killing 2 at Kenosha protests. This is CBS. CBS went through the evening and events of the evening. And what basically happened was Rittenhouse is there. Somebody's chasing him, throws a bag at him. It was like a plastic bag. And after throwing a plastic bag at him, continues to chase him because they were trying to disarm him. The person was unarmed. Rittenhouse shoots multiple times, kills him. The other person that people saw screaming, get that guy just shot that other guy, which is another person who's getting close. Rittenhouse shoots, kills. Another guy comes up with a weapon. That person is shot in the arm after Rittenhouse shoots him multiple times and he runs away. Now, at this point, they said...
That all sounds like self-defense to me. I'm going to be honest. That does sound like self-defense. I mean, that's the second one you didn't mention. The guy.
Are you serious? He puts himself...
Go back into it.
He puts himself in the middle of a protest. A guy's chasing him because he has a gun. He has a weapon.
He shouldn't have been there. He should not have been there. But that does sound like self-defense. I'm just saying that you can hold both sides of that. Like it's true that a 17-year-old should not have been there with a long arm to try to defend somebody else's property. But also, if somebody's coming at you, throwing stuff at you, trying to take your gun away, that's self-defense if you shoot them. If they're trying to do that, because who knows what happens when they take your gun away? That's the obvious thing.
They're good people on both sides.
Yeah, and bad people.
This sounds like Trump saying they're good people on both sides. You have a right-winger who drops into a protest. People rationally look at him and say, oh my God, this guy has a gun. And they try to disarm him. They're unarmed. Now, look, you could say that dude should have ran away. But the fact that you kill somebody like this and then kill another person. And then the one that I would say, yes, is the one he shoots in the arm because the guy had a gun. Fair enough. And look, I think you can make an argument of, if they took his gun away, X was going to take place.
Well, but that's the argument you would make. I mean, of course. I mean, it seems like all these people were trying to attack him. You can say because they're trying to take his gun away, but is it justified to attack somebody because they're carrying a gun? Is that the idea that if you see somebody carrying a gun, you should try to take it away from them? Or is it just patently silly? Is that idea patently silly? Because it seems that way to me.
What is the reason that Rittenhouse is there? What is his legal basis for being there to guard anything?
I don't think he should have been there. That's the thing. But once he's there, you have to look at it from within that perspective too. Once he's there, do people have the right to attack him, to try to take take his gun away, because he also, once he's there, he still has the right to have it. You know?
Well, if he's threatening people with that gun, because fact is, the only rationalization that you could
what does
come
that mean?
to
What
is
does
that
he mean?
Rittenhouse is
Did
the
he
only
threaten
thing.
somebody with that gun?
The only thing that Rittenhouse can do to stop people from doing anything is to shoot them. Do we agree on that?
No, I think that that's the main thing that he can do, but I don't think that's technically the only thing he can do. He can talk to them. If he were to be disarmed, he would have other ways to defend himself, all that stuff. But you know what? This is gonna be an interesting one. We can come back to this. We've got to go into a break. We can come back to this later during the show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're getting into it. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the
Mark is not picking up.
educator and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Got Mark.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined for this segment by Mark Sloboda, geopolitical analyst. Good to have him. Mark, how are you doing this morning?
Sean, Jamarl, thanks for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Line.
Great to have you back. Shane, by the way. Oh, yeah, it's just good to have you back. By the way, for those listening, that was the voice of Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. You can follow him on Twitter at Mark Sloboda1, and you can find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Mark, again, thank you for joining us. We're talking about Berlin. What's going on? Protests in Berlin matched in a weird cosmic sense to protests going on in the United States. But what's happening over there?
Yeah, okay, so there have been a long series of protests in Germany, actually, going back several months against coronavirus lockdown restrictions, restrictions for wearing masks, restrictions on public gatherings, etc. in Germany, like in so many countries around the world. And this politically angers a certain segment of the population, much like it does in many other countries. And Germany's Supreme Court had made a ruling canceling a police canceling of a protest against lockdown restrictions. So basically asserting their right to protest restrictions under the conditions that they would be maintaining some degree of social distancing and mask wearing and so on. This march went ahead this weekend. It pulled in, according to some 38 to 50,000 protesters, and these protesters were all across the board. The march is being kind of tarred to a degree as being a far right protest, and there were certainly far right protesters there, what are often called the far right in Germany, the so-called Reichs-citizens protesters that fly the flag of the German Imperial Reich, not the Nazi flag. Political implications. There were also, bizarrely, people flying the Russian flag and appealing to Putin, although Russian restrictions on coronavirus haven't really been any less restrictive in the past year than those in Germany. And there were also people flying the American flag, calling for Donald Trump, and protest banners referencing the American conspiracy phenomenon of Q, and so forth. But there were also LGBT flags being flown, the rainbow flag, anti-fascist flags there. It seemed to have actually drawn in a wide spectrum of people who were, for whatever reason, feel politically aggrieved by coronavirus restrictions in Germany. And at some point, they made an attempt to storm the Bundestag, the German parliament. And this caused, it has been repeatedly referred to as outrage, right, and as an attack on democracy by German politicians. I find this a little odd because some of those same German politicians were calling the storming of the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament in 2014, its seizing and by far-right forces in the right sector, flying its flags, occupying the building outside. Then they called that an act of democracy. But I guess when it's your parliament being stormed by some of your citizens whose political beliefs you don't agree with, then that's an attack on democracy.
Well, Mark, there's a secondary part to this, though, from the standpoint of Germany. I mean, this is reminiscent of Nazis trying to storm the Reichstag once before. If the politicians there were kind of... wait, 2 points. You're right about that. In our country, we would have protests. People burn down the police station. The right-wingers scream. And yet those right-wingers, when it was happening in Hong Kong, they were like, yeah, burn that police station down. Get them. So exactly the same thing on that point. But from another response, though, from the other standpoint, you're right. They do kind of have that difference in the way that they see those things. But I guess I was getting to, from the standpoint of German history, right, hypocrisy. But German history, when this was taking place before, when the Nazis tried to do this, is that why they felt some kind of way about this also from the standpoint of population? How did the population take this kind of historical reminder on this stuff?
Yeah, I think that definitely that this type of thing is a fringe political element in Germany. It does not say attract the sympathies, at least not that flag waving. Maybe the coronavirus protest against the coronavirus, in particular the phenomenon of the Reich citizens there flying that flag and others, certainly does not attract the sympathies of the German majority. And certainly there is some relevant history that makes German politicians especially afraid and sensitive to the matter. But then I think they also would have been sensitive to the large number of glorifiers of Nazi collaborators in the Ukrainian government in the protests that overthrew the government there. But that didn't seem to be the case in that particular instance either. So their sense of history replaying itself seems restricted to their own country and their own positions and politicians rather than a more general principle.
Mark, why do these protests have such a broad base? You were describing earlier the weird variety of support that's unlike the coronavirus pushback in the States, which is, as far as I can tell, coming from a relatively small portion of the right, like a vocal minority, a significant, but definitely a minority on the right. But a lot of people pretty stridently pushing back. But again, it's coming from that one corner. From what you're describing, it seems to be coming from pretty much everywhere. So do you think this is, what do you think is the cause of that?
Well, I do think that there is a broad feeling of discontent with the restrictions. Some of them feel they're unjust and unwarranted. Some of them people simply just want the pandemic to be over, as if wishing it so would make it go away, and are, shall we say, tired or fed up with varying levels of restrictions and inhibitions on their normal life. And I think definitely in all countries, the majority of the sentiment has come from the right, the far right. But I would say that there is an element of it that does come smaller in comparison from some figures on the far left. And I think that there are a number of the regular participants, commentators to fault lines, some of who come from the left, who expressed a shall we say very high degree of skepticism regarding the established scientific consensus and consensus government policies. reactions to try to limit the spread of the pandemic in their own countries. So majority right, but there is some general resentment across the board and a little kernel in the far left.
That's interesting to hear, and it's like you're saying, it just seems to be a general sense of resentment or pushback. It's coming from every quarter because everybody's feeling that pressure. It seems to be the same in the States here too, of course. Although because we have this sort of bifurcated protest movement, where earlier on there was some pushback on coronavirus, and then very quickly, back in June, early July, BLM stuff started. So it's been building for a while. It's just interesting to see again how it's split in the States compared to how it's going on internationally. What is it like? You're in Moscow. What is it like in Russia? Is there any taste of that? Any sense that there's potential for that kind of thing, or just how is it in general? How is you were a longtime critic earlier on in the show of the Putin administration's handling of the coronavirus. I remember that. Have your feelings on that changed? How are you feeling about the situation there now?
Yeah, I have been extremely critical. I felt that the administration was not strong enough, that the restrictions were not strong enough. And Russia's consistent position, polling weighing in at number 4 globally in the number of coronavirus confirmed infection cases, I think shows how the government's policy could have been better. Germany's, for instance, has consistently had a much lower infection rate. In Russia, there has been some of the same elements, and there were a few relatively small protests in the country during the height of the restrictions, as it were, people defying the orders. But as most of the restrictions, except for international travel and mass events, have been lifted in Russia, and again, other than those particular things, international travel and mass events, the rhythm of Russian life almost returned to normal, with I would say only maybe a third of the population of Moscow now really obeying restrictions, wearing masks on the metro or in stores, at least when there's no one watching. But it hasn't been as politicized and as polarized as in the West. And actually, Putin's approval rating, seen as the head of the government, actually took a sharp dip when the coronavirus restrictions were at their peak, down to some 59%, which was pretty much a historic low for Putin. But now, with those restrictions largely being lifted, life returning to normal, payments, assistance to small businesses to help deal with it, the temporary loans, eventually, if a little late, paid through. His approval rating in the last couple weeks has risen pretty substantially, up 6 or 7 points to 66%. And that's according to opposition polling.
Mark, just a quick question. We have about 30 seconds before we go into the break, maybe 45 seconds. There was a story that broke here in the United States that basically one of the, I suppose it was a guarding station in Syria where the trucks hit, and apparently they say American soldiers were injured in that crash. Now, from my perspective, Syria has invited Russia and Iran into the country. Syria is a sovereign nation. It can do that. We are not wanted there. And this takes place. Does this get breakthrough in Russian media, or this was so minor that it wouldn't necessarily matter from the standpoint of how Russian media was viewing this?
Yeah, I don't think it's just your point of view. It's simply a fact of international law. The U.S. is illegal occupation force in Syria, while Russia has been invited by the UN-recognized Syrian government. And the Americans aren't wanted there. In this game of cat and mouse and kind of Mad Max games with vehicles across the desert that has led to fisticuff and some accidents before, has now escalated to report minor injuries, and it could become much worse, right? What happens when the first American or the first Russian dies? How does public sentiment in those countries? This is a recipe for geopolitical disaster, and the U.S. needs to get its troops, its occupying troops, out of the country.
That you're listening to.
That was the voice of.
Right,
yeah, voice of Mark Sloboda. We'll be back with him in just a minute. He's an international relations and security analyst. You can follow him, by the way, on Twitter at Mark Sloboda1. That is Mark Sloboda, followed by the number 1. I'll just spell this out for you, sure. MarkSleboda1. Mark Sloboda1 on Twitter. Again, Mark, thank you for joining us. We'll be back with him in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're joined by political analyst Mark Sloboda. Mark, let's get into a little bit of a post-mortem regarding the conventions. So I would imagine you were watching those conventions, and from your position,
no,
you didn't watch the conventions.
No, it's American political theater, domestic political theater, this time completely remotely. I have very little interest because it doesn't make a difference to us in Russia, really, as far as I see it, whether Trump or Biden, Coke or Pepsi wins the election.
Interesting. You don't think Biden would take more of a stringent or more of a, just based on democratic hysteria in and of itself? Meaning it's in a democratic ethos at this point that Russia has fondled Lady Liberty inappropriately and got Donald Trump elected. That's their, if you go to the Wikipedia page, I'm pretty sure it would be there. Donald Trump got elected from Donald, it was somehow inappropriate of an election because Donald Trump, worked with Russia. But that's not a Republican ethos, which means that if you were dealing with the Democratic, let's say House, Senate, and presidency, wouldn't they be almost by definition more hawkish and more insane regarding policy towards Russia?
No, I don't think it's really viewed that way here. And that is because during the Donald Trump administration, the number of hostile events, sanctions, attacks on Nord Stream, and growing confrontation between the two countries, whether or not Donald Trump is president and what he really feels, has increased to a level far higher than it was during the Obama administration. I don't think it's unfair to say that Russian and U.S. relations right now are at a level not seen since the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
Well, wait, Mark, that's true. But wait, Mark, that's true. But that's only because of pressure from Democrats. That's kind of gets to my point. Democratic hysteria of screaming that this man was working with the Russians changed Trump's behavior. I mean, Trump got in office saying, I'm going to be conciliatory. He wasn't allowed to be conciliatory because any conciliatory thing would have got him hit by something. I guess that's kind of my point. When Democrats, by almost definition, be worse, if they're the pressure, Trump loses, and then you have not just the pressure, but you have actually the thing itself that's radiating this hatred. It seems that it would be far worse.
I don't believe that Donald Trump has actually been in control of his foreign policy throughout, to a very large degree, throughout his administration. And whatever he may feel about Russia and Russiagate, his own party, his elite, the Republicans in Congress, within his own administration, are equally hostile to Russia. And while they may defend Trump personally, rallying around their leader against what seems to be evidence accusations of active collaboration with some alleged Russian interference scheme. They are no less vocal in asserting and decrying supposed Russian interference. And then actually a large number of the neocons within his own administration that he hired have been driving. So I don't think that the end result, whether a Republican or a Democrat sitting in the White House, will make a large difference on foreign policy or relations in other countries, whether that's Russia, Iran, or China. We've already seen Biden trying to out-talk Trump on China and Iran, for instance, which were supposedly supposed to be his signature foreign policy adversaries.
And Venezuela.
And Venezuela. But I do, and when you see Biden promising to continue sanctions against these countries, I don't, short of outright hostilities and war, there isn't really much worse for Russian-U.S. relations to go at this point. And I don't necessarily expect relations under Biden to be any better. I just don't think that it's really that important whether Biden or Trump sits as, the figurehead in the U.S. How figures in the deep state, the unelected bureaucracy that runs security and State Department policy to a very large degree, I believe. I don't think it will change things that much.
Mark, I've got actually a question. I'm curious, your role as a teacher, I think, will inform this. I'm very curious about your take on this. You got into it right at the end there with this idea of the deep state, but what makes it, what created the institutions? What are sort of, if you had to look at the history of, you're talking about the State Department, but of the other institutions that make up the deep state apparatus, whatever boundary you want to put on the system you described that holds policies in place and advocates for the interest of raw power in the U.S., however you want to look at this. What are the key moments in terms of, and again, I don't even know how to frame this question because we're not talking about an exact organization, but you're describing a sort of semi-coherent mass of institutions and governmental organizations, and I'm guessing think tanks. What are the sort of key moments? What are the key players you would pick out? Again, a very broad question, but just looking at that sort of deeper axiomatic level, what creates the situation that we're in right now, and what created it in terms of its history? What would you look at?
Yeah, a lot of people don't like to use the term deep state like they use for other countries like Turkey. They fear it's needlessly conspiratorial. I don't think there needs to be any conspiracy other than an agreement on what foreign policy should be, and an agreement that foreign and military policy should be consistent regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats shuffle across the seats of power. And there certainly have been powerful institutions driving for war and expansion and creating false flags, whether against the Spanish and Cuba, or against Mexico and land grabs there. But historically, I think there was a sea change with the start of the Cold War and the Cold War solidification. And when we're talking here, we're talking, the intelligence services, but we're also talking the foreign policy establishment, termed by Ben Rhodes as the Bloc. And consistently, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, and although they agree on a small range of issues, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran was a huge watershed in how much of a split it was, in a way, under Trump. But that was largely because, as far as I'm concerned, it was a political attack by Trump on Obama's legacy rather than any real policy disagreement. But they have a consistent foreign policy formed during the Cold War and its aftermath. That would be the second pivotal moment, the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the U.S. pursues global hegemony through military, economic, cultural means, but of course, foremost military, around the world, because they see themselves as the exceptional nation that has the right and duty to lead the world. And that doesn't change whether there is a Republican or a Democrat in office. And anytime anyone tries to position themselves that maybe the U.S. shouldn't be so forceful, so overbearing and meddling and interfering and occupying around the world, they are termed as isolation suddenly. And that's the only opposite to a hegemonist. If you're not a hegemonist, then you are an isolationist in foreign policy.
Everything that you just said, I absolutely agree. Like, it's so weird. And I hear you, and it's a breath of fresh air to hear somebody actually say that out loud. Because the U.S. media doesn't pursue it that way. Like, you can look at the way we treated Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Russia, etc., China, all of those things. And it becomes extremely clear that there is an ideology at work on both sides. And that ideology is we dominate. And if there's any country that wants to have any level of local sovereignty, well, that's going to run roughshod against our notion of dominating the world, which produces war. Like, it puts you in conflict constantly with other nations. From your perch in Moscow, how do they view that? Do they view that in a similar lens? And if so, what is required of the other nations in regards to pushing back against that, just as from the standpoint of a counter move?
Well, Russia certainly does, I believe, the Kremlin and wider political assessment, even in opposition, the Communist, Liberal Democratic Party in Russia feel that way. And they feel that because of it, the United States is the number one biggest threat, not only to Russia, but causing instability in pursuit of this hegemony around the world. They feel it's a threat to Russian sovereignty, to its independence, and to its national interests. But widely, of course, we see that there are a number of countries around the world who increasingly are feeling the same way as the U.S. senses a window as wealth and power shift around the world away from it, that it is trying to tighten its grasp, before the future becomes the now. We're seeing this U.S. pressure on Russia, China, and Iran in particular, other countries, Venezuela, Syria, even Turkey to a degree, also. But in particular, Russia, China, and Iran are almost being, it seems, deliberately pushed into alliance, not because out of any real shared ideological affinity, but simply as a attempt to keep their own sovereignty, national interests, and their own culture, which they feel is at threat, against what they feel is a hegemonic United States.
Mark, thank you for joining us. We've just about got to cut it here. Appreciate you being willing to take the time. For everybody listening, you've been listening to the voice of Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. That's the number one. It's spelled MarkSleboda, number one. Mark Sleboda1 on Twitter. And you can find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. That's GRAMSCI. Mark, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Shane. Jamarl.
And everybody, for those listening, great hour. Yeah, about to go out. Joined at 8:30 by Adam Eidiger talking about microdosing, also talking about federal and local drug legislation reform efforts, specifically cannabis and mushrooms, magic mushroom, psilocybin. That's next hour in about half an hour. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. For everybody listening, thanks for listening. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, the neutral corner, I guess there are four corners in a standard sort of square room. There's the left corner, the right corner, whichever direction you're facing. Then there's the corner in front of you and behind you. I guess I'm in one of those corners, hopefully the one in front of you, so I'm not awkwardly standing behind your back. Anyway, in that corner, politically independent, I am your investigative political analyst and radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to some headlines in the news. A right-wing protester in Portland was killed on Saturday, triggering the latest escalation in political violence in the United States. This follows the arrival of a caravan of about 600 vehicles in Portland, part of a right-wing militia group called Patriot Prayer. On Sunday, Trump criticized Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler for his handling of the protests, and in a press conference, Wheeler angrily pushed back, warning those considering visiting Portland to seek retribution, quote-unquote, to stay away, saying that now is not the time to get hot-headed because you read something on Twitter that some guy made up in his mother's basement. Aaron, quote-unquote, J. Danielson, a member of the Patriot Prayer, was reportedly shot and killed by Michael Riots, an Antifa activist who had written a manifesto on Instagram about being ready to fight. These militias have been rolling up on these places in the truckloads, apparently, be it Wisconsin or apparently Portland. Trump is planning to visit Kenosha, Wisconsin tomorrow. This follows a week of protests since the shooting of Jacob Blake and a consequent wave of protests and riots in the city. Yesterday, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers wrote a letter to Trump telling the president he should not visit Kenosha, saying he's concerned the Trump presence would not only hinder our healing, quote unquote, hinder our healing. In a response, White House spokesperson Judd Deere wrote that the White House has been humbled by the outreach of individuals from Kenosha who have welcomed the president's visit and is longing for leadership in support of local law enforcement and business that have been vandalized. On Saturday, California's state Senate passed a measure to set a 9-member commission to conduct a detailed study of the impact of slavery in California and recommend to the legislature in July 2023 to form a compensation to be awarded, how should it be delivered, and who it should be given to, basically who should receive it. Democratic Senator Holly Mitchell said, let's be clear, chattel slavery both in California and across the nation birthed a legacy of racial harm and inequity that continues to impact the conditions of black life in California. This has to be done by the government, meaning the federal government. The federal government can expand their budgets. States have to have consolidated budgets, meaning they don't control their own money. States aren't sovereign currency. The federal government is. I appreciate their attempt to do so, but they're going to run into budgetary issues if they indeed try to do something that is fair and commiserate with what was encountered. Turkey started military exercises on Saturday in an eastern Mediterranean standoff with Greece, while Greece is planning its own rival naval military exercises with France, Cyprus, and Italy. This recent conflict began when a Turkish seismic vessel ventured inside Greece's coastal waters with warships to do petrochemical exploration earlier in August, south of the small island of Casterzero. This caused Greece to try to reassert and expand its nautical jurisdiction. On Tuesday, Greece's foreign minister, Nikos Denidas, accused Erdogan of advancing a neo-Ottoman strategy in eastern Mediterranean as part of an attempt to implement expansionist aims against neighbors and allies. President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will be boarding the first commercial flight to Israel to the UAE, United Arab Emirates, today, following an announcement he made yesterday alongside the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the United States National Secretary Advisor Robert O'Brien, that quote-unquote stage is set for Israel and other Arab nations in the region to create stronger ties and quote-unquote previously unthinkable economic, security, and religious cooperation. On Saturday, the UAE formally ended its commercial boycott of Israel, although the two countries have in fact quietly conducted business for years. Monday's flight of the LAI plane from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi, will be the first known flight of an Israel commercial airliner from Israel to Emiratis. The two Mid-East countries are expected to sign a formal agreement at the White House in the coming weeks. The Israeli military struck multiple targets in Gaza with tank fire early yesterday morning. This follows weeks of incendiary balloons launched from Palestine into Israel, which have caused fires in the fields and farmland. In response, Israel has closed Gaza's sole commercial crossing, leaving Gazans with only few hours of electricity a day, while also preventing fishing along the territory's coast. This also comes as authorities in Gaza reported the first of their local transmission of the coronavirus. Oh man, that is going to be an emergency, mark my words. They're in an open-air ghetto that is basically closed in, and with local transmissions increase, the more people are impacted or packed together. That is going to be an issue. There are riots in the city of Malmo in Sweden after far-right activists in the country burned and kicked Qurans near a predominantly migrant neighborhood. There are more than 300 people gathered to protest, leading to arson and rioting in the city. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines. This is Thomas and Stranahan. So, I think it's interesting. A few of these stories are interesting. I want to talk about things from third-person perspective, though. Let's talk about Israel and UAE. I would make the argument, cynical, that the UAE and Israel, the people who are, let's say, especially in the UAE, that are rich, that are wealthy, that are part of the kingdom, they want to do business. They want to expand their wealth, expand their riches, and expand their reach. And they want to do this through economic means. The issue and the sticking point are the Palestinians. But just like Saudi Arabia, they don't absolutely care about the Palestinians, especially in the context of their own riches. They make this deal. Now, I know some people may say, well, look, they're making this deal for optics. I don't think they're making this deal for optics. I'm thinking they're making this deal because they actually do want to enjoy a fiscal relationship with Israel. And looking at the standpoint of the Palestinians, I think to them, especially from the standpoint of royalty, it matters less. I would wager to you that this is no different than the Democratic Party giving lip service to lefties when really the people who they're really listening to are the oligarchs that is making sure that when their kid grows up, their kid's going to have a job in the business. When they decide to retire, they're going to get a job in the business. Or for that matter, they're going to get campaign funding, and that money is not going to go to somebody else because they are going to be soldiers for the oligarchs. I'm making the point to you that in the same way that lip service is given for this reason, lip service is also given for the other reason towards Palestinians. And the reality of it is, the truth of it is the business. Now, that's cynical. And some people can say, no, man, no, you're not understanding it. That religious thing matters a lot more. I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. There's one other point I want to make. The Palestinians are sending fire balloons, over into Israel. Now, when I look at this stuff, my analysis typically goes towards what's primary. And what I mean by what's primary, where does your decision space have its widest leverage? Meaning, if you could do something to change something in the future, what's that point where you can make that yay or nay in order to make sure something, let's say, goes better as opposed to not? Meaning your position doesn't get worse, where your decision space gets more and more constrained in regards to chaos around you. Kenosha. Now, I did the due diligence of looking at the Kenosha stuff, and I'll make the argument that the protests about Jacob Blake being shot are not entirely about Jacob Blake being shot. If I'm looking at a poverty rate that's near 40%, that means that people are dirt poor, don't have ends, they're living in this. Some people deal with this through means of suicide. Some people deal with this through means of drug abuse. Some people deal with this through means of depression, believing that their lot in life is entirely their own. In dealing with stuff like this, you have others who say, more competitive, I'm not going to live in a life where this is my lot. And whether it's being violent, whether it's selling something, whether it's turf property, whatever that is, I'm going to do this to make ends meet. It's not all. It doesn't have to be all. It can be a small percentage. Something happens sets that off. When it sets that off, everybody uses the name of the person who was involved in that in order to set it off. But I'm trying to make the basic point that when you look at unemployment, when you look at death rates, even when you look at people who are going to be evicted out of their homes, there's a disproportionate share of those people that are black. When you look at those communities, the overwhelming majority of black communities are in prisons or jails. That's astonishing to me. And that goes on for decades. Nobody cares. That's the point I'm making. You've alienated one of your societies, and I would wager to you, if you go from society to society or area all across the United States, the most violent are the most impoverished. The most crime-ridden are the most impoverished. And those are the things that we don't care about. The comfortable class of the world. Something explodes, and the comfortable class says, oh my God, I don't like that. You're making me uncomfortable. What's primary? You go further, and you have right-wingers or people who say, we're going to defend these businesses because the violence against those businesses is indiscriminate. Every bit as much as the violence against the impoverished was also. It's a death spiral. And while one side can say this is the person at fault, the other side can say this person at fault, it really doesn't matter. It goes in this kind of mechanistic way where your society unravels. What's primary? My argument is primary is policy. Whether that's in Israel and their policy towards the Palestinians, or whether that's here in the United States. Shane, what do you think of what I just said? Do you agree or disagree with it? Meaning, do you look at it and say, look, whoever's at fault, this needs to stop? Or do you look at it and say, yeah, there are sides that are at more fault than others. And what really needs to happen is issues of policy to resolve it, not throwing in more cops, not throwing in more military, not even a speech. It's honestly engaging your system and your society in a way that says we're going to deal with the primary factors while also dealing with the fact that we can't have businesses being destroyed that are innocent. And not just innocent, some of those businesses might have even supported these guys. And so, what do you think
I'm
about
sure
what
a lot
I
of
said?
them did, but again, how do you do that? That's the thing. How do you do that? So I mean, I could agree with both sides of what you said. You kind of gave me an either or in terms of what side I would take, but there are parts of both that I agree with. I don't think either side. We should have long since dealt with these problems, but that's no excuse for the rioting, obviously. And I would condemn in pretty damn harsh terms anybody who's taking it to that degree, because they're helping nobody. Because you can justify it saying, it's the language of the unheard, or that it's the voice of the oppressed, or you can put it in these different ways. But if you look at it pragmatically, you were talking earlier about levers and what levers you can push if you want to create the maximum possible difference. I think in that same way too. I thought about that I've thought in that way for the long term. I think you come to over time, because you just have to prioritize and look for what you can actually do to make a difference. Right. These are not making any positive difference. And therefore, I just on those terms, using simple consequentialist ethics, if the simplest possible thing, it's not doing good. And then you get into all the follow-ons. The fact that the communities that are often being burned down are exactly those communities that are already poor. So it creates a self-perpetuating cycle of despair. I mean, where is that in the conversation on the left? That's. I hear that occasionally. I hear people giving nods to that, but then that's always sort of added as an addendum, as a justification for the worst excesses of the protesting. If there's a continuum of activity here between protesting and rioting, if they're not categorically different, but you want to see them as sort of two ends of the same spectrum, and there's a conversation there, but just taking for a second, if you want to see it that way, then the protesters in some sense do need to have an opinion. They're in some sense responsible for some of the things that some of the rioters are doing, because they are giving cover to it. And I don't know how the left in this case is going to deal with that issue. And I think that in the long run, it's going to tear them apart. I think it's going to tear their base apart, because everybody else is going to see them as if the left as such, as including the Democratic Party, including the nominal left, if the nominal left doesn't do more to focus on solving this problem, I think it's going to cost them dearly. And I think we're already seeing the signs of it.
All right, so let's take a break. I want to answer that when we come back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking it in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us content a like and a share. If you want to join into the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. It is your engagement that makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Feel free to call. I'm going to go to callers, but I just want to make a basic point. In my context of this, I look at these as mechanistic processes, meaning you allowed something to propagate for decades that nobody cared about. It explodes, and now people care about it. And people want to give an afterthought to the fact that it took 50, 40, how many ever years for people to live in situations like this, for this to take place. To give this basic addendum of, yeah, those problems should have been fixed long ago. However, the protests that are, whatever you want to say is indiscriminate, if you want to make something of right, wrong, justification, none of those things are real in real terms. They don't exist. We, as a society, come up with those things, but the society that comes up with those things takes a point of view depending upon the situations to which they find themselves. Meaning, it is pretty easy to use the impoverishedness of a society, the alienation of a system as an addendum. I'm making the point that that's primary. And if you're going to look at the problem and say, honestly, look at it, and say it is infinitely foreseeable that people behave in ways that is not in the best interest of their society, or, to be honest, themselves, when they are presented with the challenge over a long period of time, and when that stuff builds up. The issue here is policy. I understand that I don't like the protests either. I don't like the fact that businesses, mom and pops, are torched and whatever else. And again, it's in their own society. So yeah, I agree with you that that's bad. I want to make the point, though, that the emphasis needs to be placed on the policies that have allowed that stuff to propagate, because that is where it begins. Where it ends is unraveling of your society, as right-wingers feel perfectly right and just in defending properties that were innocent. I'm making a point, the unraveling of a society starts with policy, and that if you're going to put a pot on anybody's house, start there. Let's go to callers. Michael in Silver Springs. Michael, how do you take it? What's going on? What's on your mind?
Hey, Jamarl, I just want to say that I disagree with you wholeheartedly.
Go for it.
I respect your opinion, though. I just think that the problem is the judicial system. Because in politics, the nature of politics is that there's more than one side. So, therefore, you can go back and forth forever. And as an addendum, I just want to say that the policy is so robust, meaning that even in just the laws of one particular United States state, like, for example, Alabama, marijuana laws, let's look at that, or magic mushroom laws, they're completely different than Colorado.
Right.
So if someone gets arrested, so it's a fairness. So I think it's the judicial system, and I think people are in denial, and that's another problem.
But wait, Michael, the judicial system is just based on laws that politicians put into play. I mean, the judge is basically following the law. Ideally, under normal circumstances, the judge is, unless he's doing something else. I mean, so he's constrained by the laws that people put into effect.
Well, do you think that I think it comes down to judgment, not policy. And I think the judgment.
Yeah, I think it is both. That's the crucial thing. It's just there's both.
Yeah.
Is that you have the body of law, but you also have precedent, and then of course you have political bias in terms of who you're inserting to do more precedent, to do the actual judging, to do the work itself. So I mean, you have the body of law too. But then of course the other side of this is it's not just in that moment. It's that you're setting new precedents in place that are going to affect things for decades to come. So that's another lever. If you're looking at levers, The judicial system in the U.S. is one, definitely. Michael, thank you for the call. Appreciate the call. We've got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey guys, good morning. I think that all of these things can be true or are true, but I think the issue, well, possibly. How about this? Possibly the issue is that we're forgetting that we're in a state. We're dealing with either a failed state now or the beginning of a failed state. I like to think of failed state, and I think that when we're talking about the protests, the rioting, the people responding to the rioting, the clashes, the violence, the people trying to keep the violence down, but it's still violent. We're at a point where I think rationale is kind of tossed out a bit. You see what I'm saying? Because you have the rational control measures that should have been put in place from the beginning would require that the state is doing its job and that everybody is thinking rationally, and that's just not the case. Once it reaches the point where people are spilling out into the street, especially under the circumstances that we're dealing with now, all of that goes out of the window. And I think that people don't want to accept. I mean, it's cool for smart conversation, but all of that goes out of the window because people out on the street, whether you're a protester who's out there trying to make a change and, at home your lights are off and you've gotten kicked out, or you're a right-wing nut who's going to do something, but you're dealing with the frustration that your lights are off and you hate these people doing whatever. Everybody's bringing their different frustrations and angers and rage into the situation. So the idea of controlling it in a positive way, I think is very thin. I mean, there are things that can be done, but I just don't see I don't see our government, our state, our law officials being of mind to do that. Or even having the moral character to do it, or having the resilience to do it. I mean, I would hope that it's not.
I agree. Brave. Please stay on. Please stay on for a second. I just want to interject really quickly here for one thing. Very astute points. You were going somewhere different than I'm going to respond to, but just first of all, you're talking about this sort of institutional stagnation, the concept that we're a failed state, and that the mechanisms by which we would figure out how to solve all our problems, including the fact that we're a failed state, are themselves broken because we're a failed state, and therefore the conversations we're having are superficial. A lot of the stuff we're caught on that level. I agree with that completely. So again, I'm sorry for interjecting. I just wanted to say very astute stuff there. Feel free to get back into it.
Yeah, I mean that's all. I mean, because I don't know. I had a debate.
I hear you. Okay, no, good. Yeah, I didn't mean it. There was a little bit awkward on my part there. No, very very good points there. Completely. And I think in the long run, we're going to have to solve those problems. We've been talking about the last point you brought up, that things are effectively out of control, that there's a very thin margin of control that somebody could hope to have over the situation culturally and politically with polarization in the states right now. I believe that's specifically where you're going with that. I agree. I've been talking about that for a couple of months. I think it's getting harder and harder for anybody to control it. The way that I see this now is it's a crisis. We're entering a crisis, and what crises represent is times of reorganization, potential for reorganization, a lot of chaos, and a lot of the old institutional blocks. There's a very real chance that some of the bigger ones that we rely on, for better and for worse, are just going to start falling apart. And with that crisis, also comes opportunity. And so if you're looking for leadership, it's not going to be control over any reeling movement, either an organization, an established one like the Democratic Party, or a sort of less coherent cultural one like a protest movement. You can't control those things, but what you can do is you can try to create some new thing that can replace the systems that are decaying and fading. I think these are the excellent times to pursue that kind of thing. So, anybody who's interested in doing that kind of thing, I would encourage them.
Yeah, I don't think we have a choice. I mean, to piggyback on both of you guys, yeah, I agree with them 1,000%. I mean, it's a failed state that doesn't have the capacity to recognize it's a failed state. And people need to realize that's not. I know people think they have agency, and I know people think they have this kind of free will and everything else, but those processes are almost mechanical. People are almost just kind of because think about your world right now. Think of everything that took place and compare it for the moment to what took place when FDR took office. FDR acted as if we were under an alien siege, and he was going to use every power in his presidency, whether legal or not, to try to ameliorate the conditions. He was around during the Russian Revolution. He saw how governments unravel, and he did not want that for the United States. Now compare that to now, where you have a crisis that goes beyond that. You have multiple, including people in the streets. And system, if it was being honest with itself, it was rational, it would say, A, why are they in the streets? One. B, what is going to happen if this continues with people being in the streets and there's a response from either business, who themselves could come up with their own guns to try to defend themselves rationally, mind you. Yeah, I think, like, I guess my point is, we've gotten to the point where the parties don't even acknowledge it. It's weird. I mean, it's utterly weird.
Well, but here's my thing with the protest. So I've been thinking about this, and for a while I've kind of been tacitly agreeing. I mean, completely agreeing, just because I feel like I hadn't thought it through. The thing is, there are a lot of other people in the grassroots in the States who really don't like the protest. It's not like this is a wholehearted, it's not like all of America is standing out there protesting. There's a relatively small group of people who bring up like really, pretty deeply relevant issues about economics and stuff, and classism and racism, the history here. You have a minority of people, and then some of those people are doing crazy stuff. And then because of the crazy stuff, you have a lot of backlash from a lot of other people on the grassroots level. So it's not a populist versus elites thing. It's populist versus populists and elites versus elites. So I don't think that, again, the last thing that you were saying there, that sort of like the idea that the people in power should be trembling in some sense because this represents a potential for an existential blow. I don't think that it does.
Wait, I don't think I said that. That people should be trembling because there's some of an existential blow. Did I say that?
I think no, but no, of course not. You didn't say those exact words, but you kind of implied that. You implied that the people in power should be concerned that because like, in other words, if these protests continue,
I see.
In other words, they should be concerned that if these protests continue, they're going to be destabilized. They might lose control. I don't see that happening.
I said society unravels.
It's not.
No, my argument was society unravels. Well, let me say, the reason why I say that is, whether the protests are right or wrong is almost irrelevant. It goes with a certain degree of momentum, where you have a response to that protest of right-wingers who say, we're going to defend this property, or even the business owners themselves. If right-wingers didn't come, those business owners could rationally go out, I'm defending my property from people, mobs. And what happens at that point? I mean, you basically have your society fighting one another. I think that unravels your system. Like, whatever you want to think of anything else, like the protests, however you want to argue or frame protests or right-wing backlash, whether you like it, hate it, and in between. It gets to the point where both sides escalate.
Yeah, no, the things are unraveling. I didn't want to disagree with that in the slightest bit. What I did want to sort of disagree with, and maybe I just misread or misheard what you were saying, is just this idea that like that these protests, these sort of leftist protests in the U.S., the BLM protests and some of the other ones that have been sparked up in association with them, that maybe take a more classist view of things. I don't think that those have a real. They don't have a moral aegis. They're not representative. There are plenty of people who disagree with them. That's all that I wanted to disagree with. And I'm not even saying that that's wrong.
But that's true.
I don't do an appeal to authority.
No, it's a flat fact that's
true. I'm a dissident against authority.
No, I agree with you. It's a flat fact that's true. I mean, if you look at the recent polling that's out, you have the public that's wavering on the protests. Like, it's like anything else. If something happens, they say, oh, right, this is warranted. And then the further you get away from it, the less, it's almost resonance that it has. It's like you get farther away from it, kind of like a light beam being spread out. And you have more and more people saying, okay, yeah, we're not all in for this. Like, so it does change in regards to the way people look at it. I agree with that point. And I guess my thought is, it depends what happens. If this stays entirely in a racial framework, you're absolutely right. If this gets into this notion of class, then I think you're wrong. Because that envelops everybody. I mean, especially with all of these people who lost their jobs and all of the loans being stopped and all of the money stopped being doled out for the stimulus packages. I think that ends up with a far more bang for its buck than something that's specifically under the guise of race. So it depends on how these evolve over the course of the next few months on whether or not I think you'll be right or wrong. Is that fair?
I think so. I think so, totally. I mean, another thing, we're going to go into a break in just a second, coming back with Adam Eidinger on a totally different topic, talking about microdosing and other
right.
psychedelics. So, but I mean, another, just real quick, it's also, we should talk about the 60s, man, because there's both in the 50s and the 60s, you have the civil rights movement. You also have the Watts riots and the development of the Black Panthers, Malcolm X. There's this whole cluster of history there that I think is, indicative of where things can go and sort of lays out the dimensions of political action, lays out the conversation here. So we should go back and talk about that stuff more in the future, just putting that in as a footnote. But we're going to go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
You check tab.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Eidinger. We're joined by Adam Eidinger, activist and organizer in the fight to legalize cannabis. Adam, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Been a really busy weekend of demonstrations here in Washington.
How has that been for you? Yeah, maybe we should start there. We're bringing you on to talk about microdosing psychedelics and federal and local drug legislation reform efforts. I know that you've been prominent in those in the DC area, but the demonstrations you were talking about, what have you been seeing? I believe you're based in DC, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was the anniversary of the March on Washington this past Friday, and really from all week and through the weekend, there were widespread Black Lives Matter demonstrations, especially during the Republican National Convention held at the White House. I lived in D.C. most of my life, and I've just never seen such a crazy situation where in a predominantly Democratic city that only gave Donald Trump 4% of the vote in the last election, that they decide to have the Republican National Convention here, and then expect the local population to just accept it and be respectful when the president himself is not being respectful by having this party on the South Lawn with campaign signs, violating the Hatch Act. It's completely, tossing out the script on what is acceptable political campaigning by a president while in the White House. And it's so offensive to see, Trump fireworks over the District of Columbia when nobody really wants it here. And then the last thing I want to say is, during the RNC, I was injured by the police simply for walking in the street on a closed street where the police charged in and attempted to stop a peaceful march that was many blocks from the White House, nowhere near the White House, not threatening the White House in any way, but to have Secret Service, uniformed Secret Service come in and push me from behind, causing me to sprain my foot again, re-injuring my foot, and
oh, geez,
I'm just sick of it. I live in America. I don't live in a dictatorship, and I feel like this president and this city has been terrorized for months now by armed police who are shooting flashbangs at people, rubber bullets. And I'm a peaceful demonstrator. I do not believe in property destruction or violent demonstrations in any way. I don't believe in throwing things at the police. I think all that undermines our cause here, which is equality, justice, freedom. And yet, there's barely a mention in the mainstream media. And yeah, we are trying to end the war on drugs here. And I hear the president talking about that from his campaign speech at the White House. And it's mostly BS. We still have 500,000 marijuana arrests happening a year in this country, predominantly African Americans. We still have a drug war that criminalizes almost all drug use when it should be treated like a health issue. And so, I see it's all connected, and it's been a really difficult few days, to say the least. I mean, I was out Saturday night as well, and till 4 a.m, there were police firing at pro-demonstrators, and there's just so little coverage in the national media of what's happening in Washington, D.C. It has not really stopped here. All of downtown Washington, D.C., most of it is boarded up and closed up. And this is Trump's America. This is the result of 3.5 years of just awful policies, of just insulting much of the American public, insulting democratic cities. So I'm very concerned with what's happening in this country right now. And I'm obviously a drug policy reformer, a cannabis activist. But I can't help but mention what's going on right now here. It's not
Adam, let me interrupt for just 1 second. If you're on a speakerphone, could you speak directly into the phone? It's giving a little bit.
I'm not on speaker. I'm in a room that has an echo. Maybe I should get out of this room.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, fair enough. I wanted to dig into something that you said for the moment. You made the point that this is Trump's America, and that this is basically all happening because of 3 years of Donald Trump. Is it fair to say, though, that Donald Trump was not America falling off of a cliff, that basically Donald Trump was a perpetuation of the previous policies, and that 3 years would be insufficient to get a country to this point where basically Democratic and Republican policy got us here? Meaning, whatever Trump is grotesque, and I agree with you. And whatever gruesome policies he has, on that, I also agree with you. That basically, what people are complaining about gets further than the issue of either Black lives, and it goes into issues of class. I mean, people are out of work, but even before Trump took office, you had, the majority, like half of the country living in poverty? I think 42% were making $18,000 a year. Meaning, for whatever Trump's failures, the country was primed for this collapse, and that collapse came from both parties. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you think that I'm missing something in that assessment when I look at our politics?
I absolutely agree with you. It is a fair assessment to say that both major political parties that have run this country for forever, as long as I've been alive, are responsible for what we have in this country. But I've been an independent. I've been a Green Party member. I'm currently a Democrat, and I just don't see the kind of irresponsible behavior coming from the Democratic side of things as I see from the Republican side of things. And I also think that when the COVID really was threatening us back in February, we had an opportunity to unite the country if we had a president that could put partisanship aside and focus on meeting the needs of the public. And he didn't do that. He continued to play up racial divisions, and he continued to play up divisions in the country because it would help. He thought it would help him. And at this point, I think Trump sees violence in the streets will help him electorally speaking. So he's fanning the flames of violence. And so, I think there was an opportunity here where him and the Democrats could have worked closely together and maybe prevented 180,000 deaths that have happened. Now we have the worst results in the world. I mean, the president is lying about the statistics when he says that we do more testing so we have more deaths. No, that doesn't make any sense. People are dying. There are death records. The New York Times compared the death records from previous years to this year, and we have a huge spike in death in this country, unprecedented spike. And it's really obvious it's COVID. It's, doctors are saying in the death notices it's COVID. And then, yet there are people out there that are still even doubting that are saying it's a conspiracy theory, that people really aren't dying. This is just to control us. Come on. I'm so sick of the falsehoods. And anyway, the normal.
Yeah, we talk about that stuff. We get pretty tired of that stuff too. We can keep talking about this. I'm going to come in with a sort of slightly contradicting standpoint here, devil's advocate, genuine position of mine, but it's going to be an oppositional one here, which is people are making this about Trump. They're making it about the Republicans. They're making it about right now in 2020. But at the same time, they're also talking about the long-term, decades-long, centuries long, but at least decades-long history where there's a 50, 60-year period within which we are ostensibly supposed to have fixed this problem on some deeper economic level. And now, at the same time, they're, for good reason in some cases, pushing back on Trump, or for instance, the use of unmarked troops. And some acts of egregious police violence, including some of the ones that kicked us off. But also, the first wave of these protests started under Obama. And like I'm saying, there's a decades-long history here. You're talking about Republicans using violence in the streets for political purposes. Aren't Democrats, can't they be accused of doing the exact same thing? Isn't it really a pox on everybody's houses here? I think people are making this about the right wing, and that's playing into the election. Isn't that helplessly what's happening here?
If the president didn't want more violence in the street, he would be encouraging his supporters to mount up pickup trucks with machine guns, and that was happening in Portland, and driving into Democratic cities to basically harass the citizenry, and they were driving around pepper spraying people. All the video is out there. What I've seen in D.C. is
peaceful demonstrations, and then the police, for whatever reason, and sometimes it's even legitimate reasons, that they need to clear an area, decide to clear a street and attack demonstrators. And then they wonder why people are throwing things at them because they're being attacked. Look, all the violence at the demonstrations is undermining the cause. I mean, it isn't helping any cause here. And it's really, I think, helping those
that's
who
the
say
thing.
Law and order. But that is the thing.
Yeah.
When let me give you an example. Under Barack Obama, I led a demonstration of almost 1,000 people at Lafayette Park in front of the White House to call for an end on the war on marijuana users. I mean, we were still getting 500,000 marijuana users arrested a year under Barack Obama. And so we didn't pull any punches. We were out there protesting Obama, demanding meetings with the White House. We got a meeting with the White House. We never got assaulted once by a police officer, by Secret Service in front of the White House. They never closed Lafayette Park. Lafayette Park remained open the entire 8 years that President Obama was in office. Today, Lafayette Park is completely fenced off like a jail, and that is the traditional place for demonstrations to take place. They're trying to silence the demonstrations by any means possible and then discredit them with violence when they attack the demonstrators. I've seen this over the years. I've never seen this kind of treatment of the First Amendment in the nation's capital. Even blocks and blocks away from the White House, people are having their First Amendment rights denied to them. You have a right to demonstrate, and they are denying that. I think that's the issue. Go to Lafayette Park right now. It has been closed for months. No one is able to even walk into that park anymore. And that's a public park for demonstrating. Oh, because of the president's safety? President Trump has built a wall around the White House. Literally, they raised the fence in front of the White House by 10 feet. Now it's like the fence is so high that it's impossible to take a photo of the White House without seeing what looks like prison bars in front of it. But of course, you're not going to even see that because they got the whole park closed now, and so it's even buffed out even more all the way up to 16th and I. And we used to be, 8th Street. It's just a constant flow of denial of First Amendment rights, and then police reacting angrily to any kind of demonstration. What happened on Saturday night, it said defund the police, was painted for the third time on 16th Street in Washington, D.C., right in front of the White House. The police wanted to close the Black Lives Matter Plaza for one reason, to paint over defund the police. And they brutalized, they used flash bangs, pepper spray, tear gas, after it had been banned by the D.C. Council. Just recently, it was banned. Like, they cannot use tear gas here, and yet they're still using it. So who is like breaking the law here? It's the police, and they're violating civil rights.
I don't. So here's the thing. I don't like you're talking about stuff that I don't like either. I don't like Trump doing that. I don't like that. I don't like any of it. And so we brought you on to talk about a little bit about psychedelics, but also legislative reform. Maybe we can get into some of that stuff in the next segment. And I didn't want to trivialize it, so I didn't do it. But I almost wanted to ask you, is there some way that psychedelics might help the country come together? Because this is intense polarization. Maybe we can come back to that. But just briefly, while we're staying specifically and explicitly only on this topic, I'm just worried that this is all sort of the circuses part of bread and circuses. I am worried that this is all a sort of gladiatorial style political combat, political theater that is distracting from any hope of changing what we need to change on a deep level in terms of fixing the problems that have broken our country on the deepest level. And I have that conversation. We have that conversation every day, and yet we constantly also come back to this conversation where we're talking in the terms of that gladiatorial combat, and it's damn frustrating. And so that's why, again, I don't want to trivialize it. Psychedelics can sort of help to pierce the veil, to people have argued, and some people have experienced in terms of being aware of some of the wider context of their decisions, of their lives, of their connectedness with other people, all that stuff. Maybe we can get back into that, but that's just that's my foundational take on this issue. It's frustrating to see it happening, and I wish we could do something more productive with it.
For sure. Well, do you need to take a break, or do you want to keep going with it?
Yeah, we can take a break. I didn't want to cut you off. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, Adam Eidinger. We'll be back in a minute.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. Joining us is Adam Eidinger, activist and organizer in the fight to legalize cannabis. Thanks to his tireless efforts, Initiative 71 became a proposed ballot measure in the 2014 DC elections, which ultimately resulted in the legalization of cannabis in the nation's capital. Adam, you are the reason that I can go to DC now and buy a ton of marijuana and drive it back to my house legally. So I appreciate that, and I want to thank you. You're a patriot, my man. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want to say something else. I appreciate your point of view, and I appreciate Shane's. And I think sometimes we get into this notion that it's either or, when it can be both. Meaning, it is circus. It is gladiatorial combat in the political space where people are kind of going after each other. Whereas there may be higher machinations in regards to putting stuff out there for people to fight like that. I think both are true, right? And I think on some level you kind of need the political fisticuffs at the beginning in order to even get to where you want to in a higher authority of things. But let's talk about cannabis legalization. There's something else that you said. People right now are being dragged away and put into a cage for smoking a plant. I find that to be an outrage. Honestly, I do. And oftentimes the fines and everything else that take place, the destruction of their life for smoking a plant. And they can be dragged away by an alcoholic officer with that officer or the court finding no weirdness in the situation that you're going to have a cop that's drunk and a judge that's drunk, and yet they're throwing him away. You must follow the law. So I agree with all of that. How is that going in as a push for the rest of the nation? And do you think that if Joe Biden got in office, that this would be something different as opposed to how Trump has been handling this very specific issue?
Okay, so it is still a struggle around the United States. I mean, if you have listeners outside of D.C., say maybe in Nebraska, there's going to be a ballot initiative in Nebraska for medical cannabis, or maybe Montana, or where they're trying to legalize. There are lots of states that have medical cannabis but not adult use cannabis. Pennsylvania has legislation that is expected to pass to set up cannabis for sale in the state's liquor stores. They call them state stores in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So there are states that are looking at this. A report came out that showed that, I think it was in Oregon, that sales of cannabis had actually gone up since this new depression that we're in started. And so it's a recession-proof or depression-proof industry that it will continue to be lucrative even when the rest of the economy is faltering, and it could bring in needed tax revenues. So it is what let me just get rid of the problem. The way I see it for cannabis is that we don't have a federal policy yet. We have the MORE Act, which is scheduled to be voted on in Congress later in September. The MORE Act is very good. I mean, I support it. I think it's not, no legislation is perfect, but it does do one very important thing, in that it removes cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act entirely. And once that happens, I think you could then see the next step of interstate commerce, where you actually have farm states, and many of them are red states, selling cannabis to blue states or to blue cities where the market is. People don't grow things in the cities generally. I mean, much of the cannabis that's being produced in the United States is overpriced because it's being grown indoors in cities. Even here in D.C., all of the legal medical dispensaries have to buy their cannabis from indoor cultivators, except for one that grows it on the roof of the building. But everyone else is growing indoors with, about 20% of their operating expenses going to the power company, pay for light, which is just nuts. I mean, we have a sun. We don't need to be growing this plant indoors. But the reason it's being grown indoors is a vestige of prohibition. So there's a lot of reform that still needs to happen, and we need a way for farmers in farm states, California or Colorado, to be able, or other states, to be able to ship out of state. And there should be a federal excise tax there should be some sort of tax revenue coming from this interstate commerce to help regulate it, but also to, bring in new revenues. But we also can't overtax it, because if we do, then we'll still have a huge underground economy, which doesn't bring any tax revenue in, which is really the situation in D.C. right now, where probably 90% of the cannabis is purchased illegally still, with only 10% being taxed and regulated through the medical program. The medical dispensaries have been begging here for the right to sell to adults 21 and older, because the voters approved adult use 21 and older. So why do we have to go to a doctor still to get a doctor's recommendation? So I think, my biggest disappointment with Joe Biden, and I really wish I could get enthusiastic about him, but I can't. He's too much of a drug warrior and too much of an old guard on the drug war. He even wrote the 94 crime bill. I mean, I was working in Congress at the time, and I even worked on the 94 crime bill and realized in the real time that how wrong that bill was, and never worked in Congress again after that, mainly because I just didn't want to be part of that system. But here's Joe Biden, and one of the things he did with Bernie and the platform committee fight for the Democratic Party was remove federal legalization from the platform. It was put there in 2016, and now it's gone. The party got regressive, and I hate to come on RT or Sputnik and trash talk the Democrats, because I am a Democrat. But I have to just say, they totally screwed up their marijuana policy to the point where all the marijuana voters I know, people who make this their number one issue, it's probably around 1% of the voters in the United States, this is the number one issue to them, are just dismayed. We have nowhere to go. We don't see this
stop.
in the Republican
You
Party.
actually do have somewhere to go. I hate that statement. You've internalized what basically Democrats have been telling lefties and people who are, let's say, to the left. And honestly, it's not even to the left. If you ask the majority of Americans, policy after policy after policy, it comes down basically on the side of the political spectrum. They are to the right of that. And they basically told you have nowhere else to go. You got to vote blue no matter who. It's pragmatic and everything else. Is it not true that the acceptance of that makes you irrelevant from the voting space? Meaning the fact that all of these people who would say, this is our issue, and they tell you, we don't care. You say, this is popular. This is what the majority of the public wants, and the majority of the Democrats want, represent us, and they tell you, we don't care. And you still vote for that. Does that not make you, to some degree, irrelevant in the political space if you accept that framing of the world?
Well, that's I have nowhere to go. I should have finished my thought, except maybe the Green Party or the Libertarian Party. So it's like I do plan on voting for Howie Hawkins here in the District of Columbia. But if I lived in Pennsylvania or Florida, I probably would bite my tongue and vote for Joe Biden because I'm so opposed to Donald Trump.
Right.
But here in D.C., he's only going to get, like I said, 4 or 5% of the vote, Donald Trump, that is. And our Green Party candidate, Howie Hawkins, will probably get more than Donald Trump does here in D.C. So, but ultimately, Biden's going to win D.C. It's like I believe in polling. I'm a political scientist. In fact, we did polling on our mushroom initiative and plant medicine initiative here. And if we didn't have strong polling numbers, we wouldn't be doing it.
How'd it go, by the way? What was the polling on the mushroom initiative in D.C.?
Well, we polled it for the first time during COVID back in April, mid-April, and it polled at 50% with no explanation, and at 60% with an explanation, because a lot of people didn't know what it was. And one of the things that we noticed in that polling is that awareness of the initiative only about, I think it was 17%, which is pretty low. But since then, since we've collected 35,000 signatures from registered voters, we mailed every household in the district a petition because we couldn't collect signatures during the peak of COVID in public. It was a health risk. So, but after all that education work we did in the last couple months, new polling, which has yet to be released, is going to show that our support has grown dramatically, and that awareness is now close to half of the public is aware that this initiative is on the ballot now. So there's been a lot of education that's gone. It's taken place thanks to our wonderful proposer, Melissa Lavasani, who is a mother of 2 and really got interested in ayahuasca, which is a plant from South America. It's not mushrooms, as well as psilocybin mushrooms cure her postpartum depression, which was just debilitating, preventing her from going back to work, from caring for her family, Her marriage was on the rocks as a result. I mean, everything was going down the drain. And out of desperation, she broke the law, and her husband grew their own mushrooms and found ayahuasca. And sometimes you have to break unjust laws when out of necessity. And this was one of those cases. Within a year of feeling better, she decided that this can't just be kept, quiet. Like, people need to know that this is a real treatment for depression.
Wait, one second. What was her experience? Ayahuasca, I considered going to South America for an ayahuasca experience at one point. It is not considered a plant almost. It's considered almost like an entity, almost like like which gets into the whole thing for depression or post-traumatic stress disorder and these type of things. Did she give the experience, and how, did she meet something? Did she have a conversation? What was the thing that allowed her to transcend the depression?
She first experienced mushrooms, which then I think, after a few weeks later and feeling somewhat better, someone had suggested to her, you should try ayahuasca. I know a shaman who'll be, I think it was New York City, visiting New York City, and there's going to be a ceremony, and you can join the ceremony. So she went there alone without, her family, and spent a weekend doing a ceremony, and that was the breakthrough for her. I mean, after that happened, she felt like a new person and was able to get back to life. She's a person with 2 master's degrees. She's an economist. She's in the budget office for the D.C. government. She's a serious person. And really, this was talking to psychiatrists. They were all saying, you got to take these pills the rest of your life. This will treat your depression. And, hearing all the downsides of taking prescription drugs, there are. I mean, I'm not saying people shouldn't take prescription drugs. Sometimes they are a lifesaver for people. But in her case, she felt that it wasn't going to be a lifesaver, and she wanted to try a natural substance. So yeah, her ayahuasca, I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly how it went, but it can be a very painful experience. Sometimes people become extremely nauseous and throw up during the experience, and it's not fun. It's tough. It's work.
And that's part of why you were talking about prescription drugs. That's part of why I think that nobody's going to use this. Nobody's going to abuse this, at least, like they would with prescription drugs. Specifically, nobody would do it on a serial basis. Nobody would do it like every day or every week, just because, from what I've heard, ayahuasca is a very intense, overpowering experience, and usually, it affects people positively, of course, and that's why people come to it. But usually, it doesn't leave them particularly wanting to do it again anytime very soon. So that's one of the other big differences here. We only have a minute or two left. Actually, some stuff here I wanted to talk about. Real quick question, and then I wanted to get into microdosing for just a minute. But what's your real quick take on the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, a pretty prominent organization? What is your, as a legal activist, as somebody who successfully advocated for reform, what's your take on that org?
Oh, I've been a longtime supporter of that organization. I've volunteered for it over the years. I've helped organize their camp at Burning Man for the last 6 years, although it's not happening this year. MAPS is in the forefront of research, clinical research for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. MDMA is the drug ecstasy, which was banned in the 80s, but prior to that, many psychiatrists, psychologists have seen it as a promising drug for treating intractable PTSD, like untreatable PTSD, people who had tried talk therapy and other things and nothing's working. This is a 1 or 2 dose experience you have to go through to see dramatic improvement. Many U.S. soldiers.
That is what I've heard. Adam, real quick question. Because I've been teasing it, I would love to get you back on soon to go more in depth into this issue. But with microdosing, can you just in a 20 to 30 second take, what are the quantities? Should people be worried about abuse? What are the factors here with microdosing?
Okay, microdosing isn't every day. It's maybe every other day or every few days. And we're talking about very small quantities of psilocybin mushrooms. A gram or less is where you should start. If you're doing it right, you don't even notice that you've taken the mushrooms. Like you don't have a trip, if you will. So if you take a large dose,
I just want to. We should come back. I've actually done this over a period of a bit of time, and it did me good. But we should have you back on to talk about it. I'd love to. That was the voice of Adam Eidinger, activist and organizer in the fight to legalize cannabis. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming to you live from the divided states of America. On the West Coast and in the politically independent corner, I am investigative journalist, political analyst, and radio talk show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, with my co-host, of course, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And let's get back into it. We're doing headlines, as we do at the top of the hour, every hour while we're live, 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern, 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. Let's get back into them. By the way, we're taking calls in 5 minutes, 202-521-1320. If you want to call in, we'll be taking them starting at about then. But first, in the news, a right-wing protester in Portland was killed on Saturday, triggering the latest escalation of political violence in the United States. And I'll mention, to boot, the latest escalation of political rhetoric with Ted Wheeler and Trump going after each other. We'll get back to that in just a second. This shooting followed the arrival of a caravan of about 600 vehicles into Portland, part of a right-wing group called Patriot Prayer. After the shooting on Sunday, the shooting was on Saturday. After the shooting, a day later, on Sunday, Trump criticized Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler for his handling of the protests. In a press conference, Wheeler angrily pushed back, warning those considering visiting Portland to, quote, seek retribution, end quote, to stay away, saying to them that now is, quote, not the time to get hot-headed because you read something on Twitter that some guy made up in his mother's basement, end quote. I'm just going to note, of course, assuming that that's the primary goal for people. I'm sure it would be for some people to come and seek retribution. I don't know. We can get back into it. It's just a little bit biased the way he's framing it. Anyway, person who got shot, Aaron J. Danielson, was a member of Patriot Prayer, reportedly shot and killed by Michael Reynolds, Antifa activist who had written a manifesto on Instagram about being ready to, quote, fight, end quote. In sort of related news, Trump is planning a visit to Kenosha, Wisconsin tomorrow. This follows over a week of protests since the shooting of Jacob Blake sparked that wave of protests and some riots in the city. Yesterday, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers wrote a letter to Trump telling the president he should not visit Kenosha, saying he's concerned that Trump's presence would, quote, only hinder our healing, end quote. In response, White House spokesperson Judd Deere wrote that, quote, the White House has been humbled by the outreach of individuals from Kenosha who have welcomed the president's visit and are longing for leadership to support local law enforcement and businesses that have been vandalized. President Trump looks forward to visiting on Tuesday and helping this great city heal and rebuild, end quote. So that's a kind of passive override is how I'll put that from the White House. It's not at all related. In California, on Saturday, California State Senate, in our next headline, passed a measure to set up a 9-member commission to conduct a detailed study of the impact of slavery in California and recommend to the legislature by July 2023 the form of compensation to be awarded, that's reparations, how it should be delivered, and who should be eligible to receive it. Democratic Senator Holly Mitchell said, quote, let's be clear. Chattel slavery, both in California and across our nation, birthed a legacy of racial harm and inequity that continues to impact the conditions of Black life in California, end quote. In our next headline, Turkey started military exercises on Saturday in an Eastern Mediterranean standoff with Greece. Greece is planning its own rival Navy exercises with France, Cyprus, and Italy. Anyway, here's the conflict. This recent conflict began when a Turkish seismic vessel ventured inside of Greece's coastal waters. This is an island of Greece. It's off the coast of Turkey, Castellarizo. Turkish seismic vessel ventured into the coastal waters of that island. It was flanked by warships, and it was doing petrochemical exploration. That was earlier on in August. This caused Greece to try to reassert and expand its nautical jurisdiction because, again, this is Turkey with a seismic vessel coming in to do this research within Greece's territorial waters, but just off of Turkey's coast, the coast of continental mainland Turkey. Anyway, on Tuesday, Greece's foreign minister Nikos Dendias accused Erdogan of advancing a, quote, neo-Ottoman, end quote, strategy in the Eastern Mediterranean as a part of an attempt, I'm quoting here, attempt to implement expansionist aims against neighbors and allies, end quote. That is pretty standard rhetoric, and it is rhetoric we've heard a lot of because it seems to fit. That seems to be broadly what they're doing. Although we can talk about this maybe later, but I'll note, again, this is an island just off of Turkey's coast, and it's all complicated just because it's so split up. Obviously, the Aegean Sea and the surrounding sea there in the Eastern Mediterranean, hugely split up, a bunch of small islands, and the coastal jurisdiction rights and stuff. It's sensible to me that those would be a potential hornet's nest once you actually got into it. Same thing with the South China Sea. I'll note another potential major world conflict in the footing for years now. In our next headline, President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner will be boarding the first commercial flight from Israel to the United Arab Emirates today, following an announcement he made yesterday alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien that, quote, the stage is set for Israel, end quote, for Israel and other Arab allies, other Arab countries in the region to create stronger ties and, quote, previously unthinkable, end quote, economic, security, and religious cooperation. On Saturday, the UAE formally ended its commercial boycott of Israel, although the two countries have in fact quietly conducted business for years. Monday's flight of an El Al plane from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi will be the first known flight of an Israeli commercial airliner from Israel to the Emirates. The two Mideast countries are expected to sign a formal agreement at the White House in the coming weeks. The Israeli military struck targets in Gaza with tank fire early yesterday morning. This follows weeks of incendiary balloons launched from Palestine into Israel, which have caused fires in fields and farmland. In response, Israel has also closed Gaza's sole commercial crossing, leaving Gazans with only a few hours of electricity a day due to limited fuel, while also preventing fishing along the territory's coast. This also, by the way, comes as authorities in Gaza reported the first cases there of local transmission of the novel coronavirus. And in our last headline, there were riots in the city of Malmö, that's in Sweden, after far-right activists in the country burned and kicked Qurans near a predominantly migrant neighborhood. More than 300 people gathered to protest there, leading to some arsons and rioting in that city. And those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Man, so many places we could go. It's interesting how this thing is becoming. I want to just again come back to I think the main thing, the protests, the like rioting or whatever. I do see rioting, but I'm trying to take, and it is fundamentally my take. It's easy for me to push back because you're on the left, and I'm the sort of centrist person who sometimes comes on stuff from the right, but I also, advocate for reparations genuinely and have for years and have a kind of weird set of beliefs on these things. The point is, I sort of push back from the right, but ultimately my heart is somewhere in the center. Like, I just don't want people to be fighting. I want us to solve these problems, and these problems that we've needed to solve for a long time and frankly haven't. And so it's interesting that we got into that. It's interesting that we left the conversation with Adam there on that note. I wonder what we can build on that, though.
You mean from the the drug use?
It's easy. Well, we moved into that in the second segment, but where you came back, where we left it was basically we kind of, I think we all agreed.
Nobody likes rioting. But I mean, that's the thing.
Nobody likes the rioting. Nobody likes the protests. Exactly.
Nobody loves those things.
There are also deep problems that we need to fix. So
exactly. But that's my point, Shane. I guess when I look at this, people can try to take the piss out of me because I take this kind of view of it. But I, honest to God, looks at it and say, look, as further it goes in time, your decision space lessens. And when it gets that much more narrow, you have stuff like this. And there's no way out in this kind of magic bullet, magic door. It really does boil down to you have a system that is almost mechanistic in the way that it works. Even though people believe that they have free will and everything else, you don't. Meaning, like, things happen to you, your environments, all of those things. It's 70%. If you could run an experiment, say you were, a being above it all, and you could run an experiment where you shoved 1 million people through a process, through a program, an application. And if, let's say, 80% of those people end up protesting in some way or feeling some kind of way about the conditions that they were in, then you have a problem. It means that what they're doing in protests is rational, whether you like it or not. It's rational action from their environment. And this thing of us that is human nature that understands this kind of deficit of what they would consider to be fair or justice. Now, I can wring my hands at that.
Well, how does it?
But I also can point to that and say,
I can see how it's a response, but why do you think it's rational, Jamarl?
What do you mean? Why do I think it's rational for people to respond to a deficit of justice?
Yeah, well, in that way. Why do you think it's rational to respond in that way?
Because
a response is rational, but why do you think that response is rational?
it's the typical response. Like, this is not whatever I think of what it should or shouldn't be. I mean, you would agree with me that when people tend to respond to this stuff, it doesn't tend to be love and light. I mean, when you have somebody like Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, he can organize people to say, all right, we're going to come together and we're going to march and we're going to have suits and we're going to say we're men and we're this. That's one way of doing it. That takes organization. You have another way of doing it where people don't have that. And the first thing they do is we're angry. And what do people do when they're angry? Do people respond rationally when they're angry about something? Typically, no.
Well, but then they're not responding rationally. Like,
no, I'm saying it is rational.
I guess I'm confused.
That's my point. You're looking at this and trying to get, okay, these people should organize and do X, Y, Z. I'm saying that anger to injustice is a rational response. And in dealing with it, it doesn't necessarily come out in the best of ways. That's my point. I mean,
again,
and one more thing. Wait, one more thing.
Like, okay, I'm not
even the focus. Wait, one more thing. Even the focus on the protests and the riots without the precursor is problematic because it removes part of the equation that I'm making the point of saying one precedes the other. It's not that I love it, Shane. I would even argue to you that the people who are out on the streets don't love it. They don't want to be there. But you have to agree with me to some degree that those people wouldn't be out on the streets. And if Jacob Blake even got killed right there, if you had a society that wasn't ensconced in these kind of preconditions, that protest never happens. I've argued that this protest is not entirely about Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake is just a precursor. You can look at what people were living in for decades in Wisconsin, and you could come away and say, okay, they were living in bad shape. Now, you may say it may not justify rioting. It may not justify burning down businesses. And again, these are businesses that may even agree with their plight. Some of these people might have had Black Lives Matter in the background.
I guess I feel the need. I feel the need to say that it isn't justified because I hear other people seeming to say that it's justified. And so I'm like, wait, no, it isn't. But I care to have that conversation because this is a stupid conversation to have because fundamentally, I think the first issue that if you're going to look at levers, the first issue is solving whatever problems are leading to this situation in the first place.
Yes, thank you.
Just to be clear, the reason that I keep saying that is because I keep hearing other people say this stuff. And that seems stupid to me too. That seems political. It seems biased. It seems like they're lying to themselves or lying to each other. And in the process, it ratchets the tension up.
But isn't it true though? Wait, take justification, right, wrong, all this stuff. Is it true? Like if somebody says, deal with the precursor to get rid of this other issue, and you say that feels false to me. But the fact is that is true.
It's just as true to say that it would also create another Martin Luther King Jr. Like if MLK Jr., which seems to be a more elevated form of political activity and political expression and political change making, if that also arose out of the conditions of the 50s and the 60s, serious deprivation, oppression, not long out of the legacy of slavery, and obviously still segregated, still very, very terrible conditions. If that rose out of that, and that was a mechanical response to that, what I want is more of that. That's my take. I mean, if you're going to look at it mechanically, I'm just trying to be equitable here, and it seems like that's the more productive form of it. And it seems like we're stuck in the quagmire of the conversation of debating whether or not the protests are justified. But what I've been very clear about is consistently supporting the movement that the protesters are pushing for and saying that we need more leaders and that if they want to make progress, they need to have more leadership. That's completely consistent. You see what I don't understand how I seem to be advocating for what to me would appear to be the actual way to solve the problems here. And then I hear other people like trying to play this game of justifying the worst excesses of the protesters, which isn't the way to do it. Some of the protesters are protesters. Some of them are,
just so clear, go for it. It's not a game. That's the point, Shane. The point is it's not a game. The point is people have been living in very bad conditions for a very long period of time and have been basically alienated from the rest of the society that doesn't care. The society decides to throw in cops as opposed to dealing with those conditions.
It's true.
Right. All of everything that just is true.
We've all been alienated.
You get a spark. Wait.
We've
you get
all
a spark.
Been alienated. That's the thing.
Wait. You get a spark. And it sets off.
Go for it.
And once it sets off, you have people who say, I don't like that. And they want to rationalize how they think that people should protest or how they think people should respond to what they've been living through. It seems to just use all of the other stuff as an addendum and say, yeah, but these people should do something else. It's not for me to say. I think that's the point. It is what it is. It's not that I love it. It's more so that it's a rational response. It's a rational response because that's how human beings respond. Like You think?
I guess
Do
maybe
you
again,
honestly
I don't
believe?
get hit up on it because it's just the word rational. The word rational doesn't make sense to me, but I don't. It doesn't. It's just a word. A word is a word is a word to it. I don't really care.
No,
I
but
guess what
words have
matters
meanings.
is this productive and does it help? And frankly, what can we do to actually make it help more? For all
Fix the
conversations
scenario.
about
Fix
what-
the environment that causes the outburst. That's all people are asking for. I don't understand why that's not a rational response. Let's go to a break. You guys have a listen to Fault Lines. Thomas is Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory, or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls, 202-521-1320. If you want to call in, you can. Again, 202-521-1320. We have Ingrid calling in from D.C. Ingrid, you're on the line.
Yes, I have been summoned. I totally don't agree with either of you on any of this, and I just, I could do a whole half hour, but to go to the one little point that Jamarl made earlier, he may be just saying that he appreciates my calling in, but I kind of doubt it, since apparently...
No, I do. Ingrid, wait. Ingrid, I do. Honestly,
hey, Jamarl,
honest to God.
The hell off?
Well, wait, I'm just saying, I honest to God do appreciate you calling in. I mean, you were saying something there. I'm just making a point. That's not true. I do appreciate you calling in.
Jamarl, did you read the link that I sent you by the black attorney about Kyle Rittenhouse?
While I'm on the show? No.
No, that I sent you yesterday?
Oh, okay. I haven't seen it. I haven't checked it yet. But go ahead. Make your point.
And I'm just going to add to it. It's pretty well been gone over about the self-defense part, but what a lot of people have said, well, what led to Rosen, whatever, chasing Kyle across that parking lot? There's now evidence that shortly before that, there was an incident at a gas station where Rosenbaum was setting a dumpster on fire and pushing it into the gas station. At that point, Kyle, the young boy, came with a fire extinguisher, which he passed off to somebody else, and they put out the fire. Now, it's totally possible that this might have annoyed Rosenbaum, because it was just not long after that, I don't know exactly when, but that he chased him across there. And I don't really think, if you think that I'm going to be impressed by what CBS writes in a lead about murder, forget it. I've seen the actual complaint. There's a legal document. It's whatever, intentional homicide. It's not murder.
Well, I mean, it's not just the lead. I mean, it's true. The 17-year-old accused of killing two protesters and injuring one with an AR-15 style rifle in Kenosha, Washington on Tuesday night has been charged with, as an adult, with 2 counts of first-degree homicide and 1 count of attempted homicide. That's not them making that up, right, Ingrid? I mean, whatever you want to think about the case, to put all that to the side for the moment. As a flat fact, he's being charged now with murder.
She's out.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Ingrid. Oh, Ingrid dropped.
She
Man.
dropped.
Oh,
Ingrid, how could you drop?
Ingrid said that she was disagreeing with both of us. Ingrid said
Fair
disagreeing
enough.
with both of us, and then you guys got into it, and I didn't get a chance to hear how she disagreed with me.
Look, I just wanted to make a point to her. I love her calls. Look, just because I disagree, doesn't mean I don't want every call I get is, "Hey Jamal, you're awesome," because I would think something is wrong with the show. And so I love those calls. A guy the other day, what was his name? Taurus Bull or something? And he kind of was like, America is the greatest nation on earth. And, I don't mind those calls because I think those guys have a point of view that may be different from my own. And we can talk about it. I think it gets interesting. But don't drop Ingrid. We're going to talk.
Oh, no. Well, I appreciate the call in the first place. Thank you for the call, Ingrid. We've got Malik calling in from D.C. We're also still taking calls, by the way. Pardon me. I keep getting this wrong. Malik. 202-521-1320 is the number, 202-521-1320. Malik calling in from D.C. You're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, fellas. When I last was listening, and I got cut off myself and haven't heard up to this point. But when I last listened, you guys were discussing how legitimate the forms of resistance that we've seen in terms of the uprisings that we've seen around the country, and whether or not people should engage in destroying property during uprisings, and if that's legitimate or not. Again, I come from the Black liberation tradition and involved in that. Obviously, you guys must be somewhat familiar with the history of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party started their police patrols, their armed police patrols, in direct response to police brutality and police terrorism, police murder specifically. And in the later stages of the Black Panther Party on the East Coast, because of the response of the federal government and engaging in dirty tactics such as COINTELPRO and actually shooting up Black Panther offices around the country, there were several Panthers that went underground and became known as the Black Liberation Army, and engaged in several liberatory actions, such as the Weather Underground, which they robbed banks in order to fund the activities of revolutionary activities. There were shootouts. There were engagements with police departments in New York City. That stuff is well documented. And I would ask you guys, in terms of the idea of revolution, because many of us, even on your show, people are discussing America as a failed state. And if that's the case, if we're on the threshold of something like that, and in my personal opinion, we are, and the corruption of both parties is very evident and should have been evident quite long ago, when the head of state had his head blown off in front of the world, that America was in trouble, and that there was a hidden hand somewhere within American society, that those things should be evident. My question to you guys is, at what point is it legitimate for the people of America, especially the oppressed people of America, specifically African people, indigenous people, and Latino folks, to look at the government and say, you know what, we need to take this to the next level. And I'm not saying that revolution must be armed and must be violent, but that is an aspect of it when you're dealing with a violent oppressor. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for the call. Thank you for the call, Malik. I appreciate that. Look, we do get into those conversations a lot. And to me, Shane, I'll say it this way. Shane is going to entirely disagree with us. But none of this stuff is real. What's real is what happens. What's real is what's material. And a lot of these other things are conceptual states. If a person or a group of people feel that they are being oppressed and they push back on that in somewhat violent means and they win, well, the legitimacy is basically given by the fact that they won. If they don't, that legitimacy is to some degree taken away. None of it's real, and it's in real terms. People try to justify it. The group is going to justify it the way they do, and the people who they're pushing back are going to justify it. It sounds like
Jamarl. It sounds like you're almost saying you don't admit the question. It sounds like you're saying, like, you're not responding to the question that he asked. He asked you if it's legitimate. You're saying I don't believe that there is legitimacy or illegitimacy. It's just force and what's possible.
Yes.
So it's
that's what's real.
But I think there's a legitimate.
I think there's a legitimate question about legitimacy. I think the fact that he's asking the question means that he means something by it.
Okay, that's
and
fair.
What he means
You
by
think
it
I'm dodging
important.
it. You think I'm dodging the question.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I think you are a little bit.
Okay, answer it. You answer him first, and I'll come back. That's fair.
I've been pretty categorical, and I'll continue to be. I don't think that violent revolutions tend to help the people on the other sides of those revolutions, let alone the people in the status quo in the current system. I would look. Maybe the most historical, the most dynamic example would probably be the Soviets. Arguably, the modern Chinese state. We're still seeing the effects of that with Mao Zedong and everything. So maybe there are exceptions to that rule, but it seems like in pretty much every case, it's been a major violent upheaval that could have been averted if various players in those societies had been more responsible and effective. And so what I'd push for is, if it happens mechanically, if it has to, there's nothing I can do about it, but I want to try to keep it from happening.
Yeah.
Revolutions aren't nice. I don't like them,
And keep in mind, those
nonviolent revolutions are way better than violent revolutions. And so I wouldn't see it as legitimate. The question of when it becomes legitimate, I don't know. When things have already, when there is no state and you're having to create a new one effectively, I just don't think we're quite there yet. I think we're living in a failing state, and it's going to continue to decay until it either breaks apart completely or we do something to make it better. I think that's the slope we're on. What's your take, Jamarl?
Okay, I can agree with that. The violent revolutions that won were basically in times of war, right? It was a destabilization of the government. I mean, both instances, the Chinese Revolution was communist versus the state, and Japan. So you had that weird scenario. And even in the Russian Revolution, you basically had the peasants who had been living in dirt poor conditions, while the Tsar basically lived in opulence. And at the point of the war, well, those guys had guns now, and those guys got to the point they rebelled. So without that level of destabilization, and you have a strong state, it's hard to get to the point of seeing how a violent upheaval would do X or Y. So there's that. So fair enough.
Yeah.
But that's more of an argument of cause and effect.
I also live. There's this. You can get into definitions of terms. We live in something that was created by a revolution. I mean, America. Created following the American Revolution. It's also just this question of, there's obviously the whole deeper legacy of the question of legitimacy of America as a state or whatever, but it's not like there was a revolution on British soil. America.
Right, it was here. But that's kind of my point.
So I would see that as categorically different than a country that's established going through a revolutionary turnover and reestablishing itself basically.
And the Civil War.
Just to set up a little definitional boundary there.
And Civil War also. I mean, you basically had a country try to rip itself apart, armed rebellion, and you had a massive number of people that died in the United States war. And so those things are revolutions. I mean, they tried to basically take over the government of the United States. I don't want that. That's terrifying, right? And so it's like kicking it up a notch. I don't know what kicking it up a notch means in the context of that stuff. I would say this. When it becomes just, or those things, that's what I mean. Those things are just words. What tends to happen is one power takes over the other power, and they justify it and iconize it in regards to the country to which they establish. The catch here is, if you don't have enough power to do that, then it becomes not the best strategy of trying to deal with it. I think the reason why MLK chose peace was because he had no concept of us rising up in this armed rebellion and smashing the government of the United States. And if that doesn't work, you need to find other means to get your movement across. So I think
you're talking about justice. I mean, the thing with justice is that you have to. We've got to call her. So I want to go to him. The thing with justice in 10 seconds is you've got to go back to something like Plato and Plato's Republic with Thrasymachus, the character of Thrasymachus in the Republic, where he's advocating for basically there is no justice, there's only force. Might makes right, that kind of thing. But he blushes. There's this famous thing, Thrasymachus blushes, where the dialogue goes on. It doesn't end there. We should get into it. We don't have time. We got Mallory calling in from Florida. Let's go to you, Mallory.
Oh, these are great conversations. I love these conversations.
Are you referring to me here?
Oh yeah, come on in.
Yes, yeah. Spelling may be wrong. How do I pronounce your name?
And I'm calling from Fort Lauderdale. I want to first start out by thanking Jamarl and congratulating you for your speech yesterday at the convention. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Second, I want to just kind of get into What I'm hearing, I think that what I'm hearing is a bit of a conflation between legitimacy and rationality. And in my view, it seems like legitimacy is a very subjective analysis to make, and rationality is a bit more objective. And so, to that point, I really don't think that people would be out in 90-degree heat, 100-degree heat, protesting in the middle of a pandemic if for no reason whatsoever. I think that the goalpost, the water marker has changed for what is objectively rational for these people, and their reasoning changes with every death that occurs, with every shooting, with every injustice that we see, with people being evicted from their homes. So, I think that it would be folly for us to imagine that the protests that are happening in this country out on the streets at night are really solely caused or have been given rise to because of people being shot. It's because of the way that poor people and oppressed classes of people are treated. They're pushed beyond the edge. They're not even in the corner anymore. They've been burnt and they have been pounded into the concrete walls. And so they feel that they have no other choice. I mean, I struggle to even imagine how we can even get into a conversation about legitimacy or not, because we're not even dealing with the objective rationale for why they're out there in the first place in this country. As a matter of fact, I know someone who told me the other day, like, I just want all this fighting and these protests to just end. He just wants to go back.
Mallory, I hate to interrupt. I'm so apologize, but we have to get to the break. Please call back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We are coming to you out of Washington, D.C. at 105.5 FM. You guys can call, well, tomorrow, I suppose. We finish our call in an hour, but you can catch us at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Coming to us today is Christian conservative, editor-at-large, and at this writer and editor-at-large at the Sabia Report. We have Carmine Sabia. Carmine, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Very good. How are you, brother?
I'm doing all right. So we are bringing you to the show to ask you or to have a conversation about multiple topics. One is the shootings. But the thing that interests me in the moment is your Twitter bio, Christian conservative, and then you go into NRA, etc. Now, I've always made an argument that there's no such thing as a Christian conservative. So that piqued my interest. Before getting into the other items, allow me to question you on this for the moment. How do you reconcile the two, Christianity and conservatism? Do you find that those two are more in line with an ideological standpoint as opposed to, let's say, Christian non-conservative, whether that gets into leftism or something else, or even independence. How do you reconcile the two belief points?
Conservatism. Are you a Christian?
No, I'm not.
Okay, well, that would explain it. Conservatism.
Well, I grew up in a Christian household. My mom, grandmother, all of them were devoutly Christian. So it's not like I'm unaware of the faith or whatnot. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Christianity falls more in line with conservatism. Now, is conservatism Christianity? And I think this is where the difference comes in when people say, how can you be a Christian conservative? And no, Christianity doesn't fall in line with conservatism, and neither does liberalism fall in line with conservatism. These are the two paths that we have to choose from on a political spectrum. I don't believe in third-party nonsense gets nothing done. Independent gets nothing done. You're a Christian conservative, and I find that most Christians are conservative because they would match the most of our beliefs. Christians, there's this thing that people believe that, for instance, Christians aren't allowed to defend themselves. Sure we are. Sure we are. The Bible says, get a sword. So we are allowed to defend ourselves. We are allowed to defend our families and our property and all of those things. Christians are allowed to make money and then give to the poor as they see fit between themselves and God. But nowhere in Christianity does Jesus say the state is to come and take your money and give it to the poor for you. But when you come right down to it, the crux of the argument is, how could anybody call themselves a Christian liberal? How can Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi call themselves Catholics and then support murdering babies in the womb? That's where it comes down to. It's a matter of, you couldn't possibly look at liberalism and say that is classic liberalism, different ballgame. But you could not possibly look at what's going on in 2020 and say, yeah, that's in line with Christianity.
I don't.
Let's burn down buildings and riot and.
Well, to be fair, I don't. Well,
yeah.
But to be fair, I don't. By the same token, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic. There are 40 million people out of healthcare, 30 million people out of a job. People are in desperate straits. Now, how would Jesus look at that situation? And do you think he would say, yes, those people need to keep their cash, or do you think we need to do something about the illness that has perpetuated our society? Which one do you think he would side with?
You're asking me to speak for Jesus, which I can't do.
Well, but there's a record of his commentary. There's a record of his points of view. I mean, this was the guy that raided the stand on the merchants. I mean, so it's not. So if we're talking about somebody who's going to be prosecuted, you guys would have prosecuted and put Jesus in a cage. I'm asking something slightly different. That's a low blow. That's a low blow. That's not a low blow. Come on.
First of all, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were not refugees. They traveled back to their home for the census. I've heard this argument a million times. It's wrong. It's just simply wrong. It's not factual. It has no basis in fact. So they were not refugees. They were never refugees.
I never said anything about refugees. I said toppling the money table is somewhat of a radical move. But let's sidestep that for the moment. I guess the thing I'm trying to make the point of is we do have a record of how Jesus looked at these things and some of the quotes that he said.
Right. I love this conversation, by the way.
I'm not trying to be antagonistic. I'm not. I promise you, I'm not. I'm not.
No. I am very passionate about it. So as long as you're cool with me being passionate about it, I'm cool with you being passionate about it, brother.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah,
Okay.
There's no antagonism in this at all. That's not my intention.
No. Please, I'm happy to answer it.
It really is an interesting thing for me. So go for it.
I'll tell you what I believe Jesus would not do, because there's no record of him doing it. He would not say, in my belief, again, I cannot speak for Jesus, but from what I have read, I do not believe that he would come and say, well, the government has to come and take the money from you guys and fix this. I've never seen that. I heard give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but I never heard give unto God what is God's.
So you believe Jesus would allow 40 million people to go without health care in a pandemic? That would be his preference, as opposed to dealing with...
There was a lot of people suffering, and there's a lot of people suffering in Jesus' time, my friend.
Yeah, but that's because they don't... Well, come on. Let's be fair. Jesus' time didn't have the capacity to provide health care to everybody in the country, have the materials and the technological capabilities to do it. We do.
I believe Jesus would want us to. provide that health care. I don't think Jesus would say the government has an obligation to provide health care. I think he would look at us as individual Christians and say, you have an obligation to help these people. You have an obligation to do this, that, and the other thing. You have an obligation to read the CDC data and find out that only 6% of the people only had coronavirus. And by the way, I think conservatives are misreading that a little bit because they're like, only 6% of people died from coronavirus. No. Comorbidities include things like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, which most of the country has. So to say only 6% died of just coronavirus is nonsense. It is still, I want conservatives who can hear me right now to hear this. It's real. It's dangerous. It's deadly. Wear a mask, social distance, and do the things the scientists are telling you to do. That being said, I think Jesus would tell us as Christians, help who you can. Help who you can. But I don't believe there's no record of him saying the government. Show me in the Bible where he says the government has to do anything for the people.
But you're making a comparison between the times that they were living in as opposed to the times that we are living in now. And those are radically different comparisons.
Man cannot rule man, though. It's the same thing. Man cannot rule man. That's why we need God. That's why we need Jesus. That's why we need the Holy Spirit. Man cannot rule man. There is no perfect government system on this earth.
Isn't there another part of this conversation though? Is that don't you debase for one thing? Thank you for joining this comment. Don't you debase the religion when you bring it in too much? Like in other words, if you bring your religion into politics, like you should like. I'm not particularly religious, just my background, but obviously it makes sense to use that as a sort of ethical framework foundation because you can't avoid that. That's your identity. It's deeply important. So there's that. But if you're using religious argumentation for politics, or if you're basically having the conversation we're having now, which is which party would Jesus align with? What would Jesus do in terms of our modern political context? Don't you at the same time have to sort of rewrite? Don't you have to like retrofit your view of Christianity and your view of Christ to fit your political narratives? I'm not saying that again against any either of you, specifically not against you, Carmine. I'm just saying, isn't that a risk that comes with this kind of a conversation?
It is, and the thing is, my friend, is that Jesus was apolitical. Jesus didn't subscribe to any. He would not hate, but he would dismiss all politics and all parties because we don't live for this world. We live for the world to come. The perfect government will form when Jesus returns, when God sits on the throne. Until then, there will be no perfect government. Man cannot rule man. So, if you're asking me, does the conservative or Republican form of government fall directly in line with Christianity? I'm here to tell you no. But I would say that about any form of government, any political party. The answer is no. Christian conservative, when I put that on my bio, is I am a Christian / I am a conservative. My party is not Christian conservative because that's not a party. That's not a thing. I am both a Christian and a conservative. It's not saying my Christianity endorses conservatism, but I do believe that there is more about self-reliance in the Bible than there is about reliance on state. I see nothing in the Bible that says the state has to take care of anybody. I don't see that anywhere. You're supposed to rely on God, but not the state. Now, Democrats want you to believe the state is God.
No, they don't. They don't. Come on. They don't. But one more point, and I'll leave it and we can go to another conversation. But if I was a Christian, my grandmother, the preacher, the poor, help the poor, the sick, etc., and you get into office and you get into government, doesn't your values, to some degree, have to be defined by what you consider as the larger point? And if the larger point in regards to the teachings is to care for people, whether it's through government or not, is almost irrelevant. To care through people, shouldn't your values to some degree inform your politics? Meaning if I brought up thinking that I want to care about the poor, shouldn't my politics to some degree also follow suit to what I believe as an individual about my God and what my God wants?
Yes, sir, 100%. And here's the problem with that. The government's broke. The government has no money, has zero money. The government makes $0.
The United States is sovereign currency. The only time dollars will come out if the government produces them. There's no such thing as the government being broke. If you went and asked Yellen today, or whoever's in charge today, I'm sorry, I can't think of his name. If you ask them today, Powell, if you ask him, he says, if you said the government is broke, he would say no. The only place you can get dollars is from the U.S. government because that's the only place that makes them and has legitimacy for people to use them.
Where does the government produces nothing? It creates no income. How does the government get money? It has to.
That's not true. You realize that you would not have a dollar in your pocket unless the government spent that dollar. How would you have a dollar if the government didn't produce it?
What product does the government produce on which it makes money? How does the government make money? Tell me.
The government doesn't need to make a product. The government is the government. Okay. It is the sovereign item that is in our world, and it produces and legitimizes any currency that come out. The only reason you have a dollar in your pocket as a flat fact is because the government produced the dollar for you to have. That is infinitely true. No, I don't even know how you can argue with that.
We've got to go into a break. We've got to go into a break. I'm just going to come in. Maybe we can come back on it, but I'll take us out. We're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Interesting conversation with Carmine Sabia, writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. Again, we'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're back with Carmine Sabia, writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. By the way, for those interested in checking him out, you can follow Carmine on Twitter at Carmine Sabia. That's spelled CarmineSabia. And again, you can also watch the Carmine Sabia show by going to SabiaReport.com. Carmine, thank you again for sticking with us. Interesting conversation you guys opened up in the last segment. I came in a couple minutes into it just because you were going back and forth. But I just want to point out, you moved from having a high-level conversation on Christianity, the relationship between religion and politics. That's a pretty deep one. We got into talking about government. And as far as I can tell, right at the end of the break there, it was a sort of existential question about the role of government in this very deep sense. What does it do? What's the relationship with the people that it presides over or presides under, whichever way you want to look at that? It seems like we're living in those times. We originally brought you on to talk about the Portland protests and shooting. I want to turn to that, but it fits with this theme of this larger crisis in the American conscience, and I think in our sense of, I don't know, a lot of people going back and forth from the left in the protest, a big pushback, I think, against the idea of America as such, and I think you can see that for better and for worse. There's a legitimate conversation to be had there. I would take one side of it, but there's a legitimate conversation to be had there. It seems like that's the level of conversation we're at. That's the tenor of it. Does that seem right to you? Again, as people are getting killed out there, what's your take?
I think one side believes the government has a role to take care of you, and the other just doesn't, and that's a fundamental difference. When I look at the riots, I have to laugh this week. I'm seeing Trump riots trending and Trump violence trending. It's interesting how all the Trump violence and the Trump riots are happening only in Democrat cities, isn't it? It's actually absurd. It's absurd. These hashtags that are trending are absurd. They think, listen, don't believe what your eyes are telling you. It's all Trump. It's ludicrous. When I look at Kyle Rittenhouse, let's get down to it, okay? Because this is what we're here to talk about. I look at Kyle Rittenhouse, and I say to myself, all right, shouldn't have been there with a gun. It's illegal. He should get a gun charge. But he absolutely 100% acted in self-defense. Did he put himself in this situation? Now you get into the whole George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin thing. Did you put yourself in the situation to which you are now defending yourself? Yeah, but it's still self-defense. If I walk into a bar, let's say, an all-black bar, and I'm wearing a Trump hat, and most of these people, it's a Democrat neighborhood, they all hate Trump, right? Well, I put myself in a bad situation, and they might kick my ass, but I have a right to defend myself. I did nothing wrong. I did not give them a license to attack me, right? So, when you look at it from that perspective, Rittenhouse was defending himself. Now, the Trump supporter who got killed this weekend also put himself in this situation, right? The difference being he didn't attack nobody. He was shot stone cold dead because he supports President Trump. And that is the difference between us and them. The old school liberal used to believe in free speech. The new school liberal that claims to be anti-fascist is the most fascist creature on the planet. Agree with me or die. I mean, I don't know. Prove me wrong on that.
Well, I don't think it's agree with me or die, but I guess my issue is I agree with half of what you say. When Nancy Pelosi, well, there are 3 points. When Nancy Pelosi came out and said, I don't think we should have a debate, my thought was,
hilarious.
That's mind-blowing, right? I mean, because ultimately she's saying, we can coast on this particular lead, and I don't think that the President of the United States, who was chosen by the public, I don't think that Joe Biden should even regard that chosen person with a debate. I mean, that's insane, right? It's like this is the time between patriots and fascists. That's insane. But right, exactly, because she thinks that Trump is going to eat Joe Biden alive, and she doesn't want that to take place. But when you get into this notion of Rittenhouse, I disagree with that. Look,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. When I get to the notion of what?
When I get into the notion of Rittenhouse, I disagree with it. So in my head, Rittenhouse put himself in danger. Rittenhouse, underage, has a gun, is not supposed to have that gun in that state, and yet he has it nonetheless. And I ask myself the question, what does Rittenhouse expect to do with the gun? Meaning, if I'm about to set a car on fire, God forbid, and he says, don't do that, how is he going to stop me from setting that car on fire? Is he going to shoot me? It seems the only capacity for Rittenhouse to do anything is to use that gun either to threat or to actually shoot, which means he has put himself in a situation where the only mechanism at his disposal is to basically shoot somebody. I don't give that a pass at all. I think that's horrendous. And so, the fact that he gets into a fight, the fact that somebody tries to take his gun, the fact that he, shoots all of these other people, that wasn't, how do you justify that? Like, he didn't have to be there. He could have been at home playing a video game. Let the cops do what they do.
They didn't have to attack him.
Well,
they had to hit him with Molotov cocktails and attack him?
Did they have to attack him? No, but by the same token, did he have to be there? In fact, the people who attacked him were unarmed, by the way. The last guy who attacked him was armed.
Do I have to be in a bar in New York City with a bunch of people who hate Trump with a Trump hat on? But if I go there, does that mean they have a right to attack me?
No, they don't. But that's different.
If I happen to be armed, do I not have a right to defend myself?
I'm saying that's different. You going in a bar with a Trump hat, being provocative, is perfectly legitimate. If somebody attacks you, that person should go to jail. I'm saying this is not that. This is something that gets a little strange because it's not entirely within the bounds of law in general. This is where your public and your social fabric breaks down. And the question that you need to ask is, do you want to add fuel to that by sending a teenage soldier into that particular fight, or should that teenage soldier stay home and not add fuel to something like that? It's not that I love it. I don't think any of those people want to be out there. And the fact of the matter is, the fact that they're charging with a homicide, it's either for one or two reasons. Make the charge so high that he gets off, or that they actually see a case in which he murdered two people. So,
and you and I both know that that's not going to happen. He's not getting homicide. So,
well, I don't know that.
He's not getting murdered one. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous.
Oh, right there. So, do you think that they gave him that charge with the explicit notion that he's going to get off on a charge this high? Meaning,
possibly.
Yeah, I was fat when they did that. I thought to myself, "Whoa, the lesser charge is easier to sustain. The higher charge is harder because this argument takes place."
That's a big one with the cops too. Yeah, I mean the George Floyd case, that's probably going to come back. That's that issue in general of overcharging. That seems to be a large part of how this works. And then of course you create this media dynamic where somebody gets charged with a crime that seems to a lot of people perfectly appropriate, and then they don't, they're not convicted of it. And I see that as a sort of ticking time bomb. What's your take on that, Carmine?
The problem, as I see it in both cases, the cop is going to walk. The cop's going to walk because he should have been charged with either negligent homicide or involuntary manslaughter. And that would have stuck. He's going to walk. The Rittenhouse, I think, will walk for the same reason. Here's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that the people who make these charges, the district attorneys, are elected officials who want to get re-elected. So they're making political charges, not criminal charges. They're making charges that look good for them politically when they go for re-election. Hey, we charged them with murder. We can't help what the jury did. We did this, we did that. But instead of trying to get people in prison, it's the same thing I thought with Zimmerman, and people came back and you're on Zimmerman's side? Hell no, he's a nut. But you overcharged him. Why'd you overcharge him? He should be in jail right now. Why'd you overcharge him? Now this idiot, this nut, gets to keep his guns. We're all in more danger because he's on the streets because you screwed up. That's how I see it, man.
They barely even ran that case, though. I mean, if you look at what the district attorney can indict a ham sandwich. And in that situation, right, they barely put on. It was if they were working for the defense. It was a really bizarre case. It was like they didn't want to charge him in the first place. They were charging him because of public pressure. Then when they did charge him, they barely put on the case. And then they was like, all right, well, see, we did charge him at least. And so I can't say I even entirely disagree with you on that.
That guy's a danger to society. Walking around, he's going to kill somebody again. I've predicted this. I believe with all my heart he's going to kill somebody again because he's a nut.
So that was a situation where you did agree that, okay, this guy needs to be in prison.
Absolutely. I was just, as soon as they charged him with murder one, I was like, oh, we're screwed.
But doesn't he have a right to defend himself based on the other argument?
He started the fight, though.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Started the fight. I mean, if there wouldn't have been none had he not menaced Trayvon Martin. He menaced him. He didn't just observe him from a distance.
Yeah.
He menaced him. He posed himself as a danger. Trayvon Martin was acting in self-defense.
Okay, so that's your distinction between the two. That in one case, they attacked him, but in this very specific case, he attacked Trayvon. Okay, I see where you're going. Okay.
Hey, Carmine, we've only got about a minute left. I want to ask you something at a kind of high level. We've been talking about the threat of civil unrest, people dying in the streets on a weekly basis, in some cases a daily basis. We're talking about the threat of that turning into a civil war. Is that something you're worried about, or do you think that's overblown?
I think it's already started, and I think it's more of a revolutionary war than a civil war. No, I believe we have a terrorist faction called Antifa. They have uniforms, they have a flag, they have weapons. They are an invading army, and it's a real problem. And do I think there's going to be a civil war with, like it was in the 1800s in this state? Or no, but it's a civil war. It's domestic terrorism. It's absolutely war.
Yeah, and we've been. I mean, also real quick note. How would you relate this back to the late '60s? I mean, not just the civil rights movement, but also late '60s. You saw Black Panthers. We were talking about the Watts riots earlier. You also saw with the Weather Underground and just in general, like a wave of quote unquote radicalism, is I think the term that was often used to describe it at that point. How would you relate what's going on right now to what was happening back then?
You ever notice all the radical groups in violence tend to be liberal? Not a lot of right-wing radical groups that actually do anything besides play army in the park. I would relate it in the sense that it's very similar, but this is ratcheted up to 1,000 compared to what it was in the 60s.
I mean, there's stuff to disagree. I would disagree with that a bit. I mean, Dylan Roof, there are a variety of sort of far right shooters. Dylan Roof came to mind because of the white supremacist angle, because he went into a black church. But we can talk about that more. Carmine, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Carmine Sabia, writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. Everybody listening, you can follow him on Twitter at CarmineCA. We'll be back tomorrow. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining me. Fault Lines. This was a great show today. Today is my birthday. My wife and I are going to do a contributor appreciation show today. Sunday we had the politics, the convention, People's Movement thing. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us. Let's see, I don't want to miss any chats. And that was one. All right. Yeah, interesting show. I went that angle with him because I saw Christian conservative. And to me, it's like, there's no such thing. Like Jesus will say, feed the poor, ensure the deal with the hungry. Like when Martin Luther King is giving those speeches, he's talking about a socialism, yes, but it's powered by his philosophical beliefs and idealistic beliefs and his religious belief. All those things are basically the same in regards to what a world should look like. And if even beyond the Christian point, a rational belief that if you want to see less chaos, then you have to ensure that your system provides a place for the people of that society to engage and operate in that system. It's just true, right? And so when I saw Christian conservative, I was like, oh, how do you compare these things? One is miserly, doesn't want to give to the poor, wants to give it all to the rich. The other, meaning from the standpoint of, let's say, the lefty idea, or the idea of Jesus as being this kind of compassionate person who kicked over the money tables because the churches shouldn't be used in this kind of salacious way. How do you reconcile that radical lefty with your conservative beliefs? And so, we tried. I let him talk. It was interesting. None of your business. A little to help you broadcasting the 17-year-old shot in the first person and was running away when people tried to stop him. A little to help you broadcasting the 17-year-old shot in the first person and was running away when people... Right. Well, I said that basically you had a situation where the guy who was chasing him threw a bag at him, a plastic bag. And as they were pursuing, he shot him. And then he turned around when other people started chasing him and saying, yo, that guy just shot that guy. And other people started chasing him. He shot those people also. With one guy coming with a gun after the fact, who was shot in the arm, in which case the guy went back running away screaming. He gets on the phone, calls somebody, say, I just killed a guy. And eventually goes walking to the cops with a loaded weapon and walks past. The cops knew there were shots fired. I don't know whether the cops knew people had been murdered or not. They knew shots had been fired. And here's this child soldier, right-winger, walking calmly, gets in his car, drives back over state lines. He shouldn't have been there. The gun is provocative in and of itself. And what did he expect to do? He has no powers legally as an authority. So if this guy is about to set that car on fire, he says, hey, don't do that. Don't do that. And he says, what are you going to do about it? And he lifts his gun up. He proceeds to set the car on fire. What is he going to do? Is he going to shoot him? I'm making the point that he's neutered by the law itself to some degree. As long as nobody is messing with him and they're just doing their rioting, he can't do anything anyway. I hope you understand what I mean. He is neutered by law. So what are you going to do? The only ability that you have to affect that situation is if you could beat somebody up or shoot somebody down. He chose number 2. He shot people down. No, whether it's an overcharge or not, he should be prosecuted for that. That is horrendous. And that incentivizes more right-wingers to do the same. Your issue here, honestly, I'm not being facetious when I say this, is the communities that has been under pressure for a long period of time, has been alienated, abandoned, and instead of providing jobs and opportunities for the people in those communities, it instead provided jails, criminal justice, crime fighting, cops, killing, injuring. I'm making a point to you that if you want to stop the things in the streets, you don't stop it by putting in right-wingers and by throwing cops at it. You stop it by dealing with policy that has allowed your societies to be what it is, to incentivize, to push, to, make that a viable path forward. In regards to pushing back, I still say Jacob Blake was the spark. It wasn't the reason for the protests. And I make that point entirely because if you lived in a society where people thought they were having a fair shake, where poverty was not a thing in your society, and something like this happens, you don't get those protests. People might be annoyed. You don't get those protests. If they thought there was accountability in your justice system, you don't get those protests. I hope you understand what I mean. This in your world is basically set and created by the environments to which those people inhabit. Until you deal with that, nothing changes. Pop reality. That guy didn't even know where money comes from. Right. Yeah, he did. I was trying to make the point to him that your government produces currency. If you try to do it, they will put you in jail. Your government produces currency. If your government did not put that money out, nobody would have any money to spend. If the deficit went to zero, people will be basically broke. I hope you understand what I mean. This is, your government puts that stuff up. It's legal tender. You may have a treasury and everything else. You may have banks expanding the currency in this kind of electronic ways, but at the end of the day, it's government that does it. You don't have companies putting out money. How does a company get money to spend on anything if it didn't get a loan to start off? That loan, if it came from a bank, to some degree, probably came from, it's always going to originate at some point from our treasury, the government. Tried to tell them. I'm going to say like, share. Oh, right here. Ask yourself, what did Kalel do? Bob Ramirza. Happy birthday from the crew. And the crew, Maggie Smith. Oh, thank you, Maggie Smith. I appreciate it, man. None of your business, just to support your work and fight for life. Let's see. Fight for life. Come on. Where is it? Life, liberty, and Medicare for all. Yes, I would die on a flag for Medicare for all. I think it's not just useful for us as individuals, but I think so for the country itself. Consider your world. 40 million people without health care. That's mind-blowing. And when Obamacare went through, that was supposed to fix it, 27 million people didn't have it. 12 million more are without it because of COVID-19. We're in the middle of a pandemic. 30 million people have lost their jobs. And instead of the Democratic Party treating this for the severity and sense of urgency that it is, they push adjustments to Obamacare and the notion of a Medicare for all off the table, despite the fact it gets 88% support within the party. That's obscene. That's utterly obscene that they'll say, yeah, we don't care. And the only reason they say that is because they accept, they assume even, that all those lefties are going to turn around and back them regardless, entirely because they're terrified of Trump. You've lost your representative government if that's the case. Because any notion that there's a connection between what the public wants, who says, this is what we want, as we're in a pandemic, this is what we want, any notion between that connected to a political party that is supposed to represent those interests have been warped into just no way resembling a representative government. They don't care. They know you're terrified of Trump and the Republicans, so they take a cadence based on how much money can we take and how little can we do to get away with it. And if the money that we could take and the little that we could do to get, and we could sell that as least worse, we're good. Because we know that blacks, lefties, Hispanics, the poor are going to buy into it as the only thing moving in town. You're being scammed. The Republican Party has their base of sorts, and they have their base of disaffected, people who are just so angry at the Democratic Party they get those votes. I mean, those people jump from Obama to them, and they use that as a coalition to win by, knowing that the Electoral College is to some degree favorable for them. You're being scammed. This is a game of sorts that these guys are playing. Least worse, and then the other one, a different coalition to get their people in office. all the energy that you add to this will continue to perpetuate it. It's not that I love that Trump wins. I'm making the basic point that at some point, you need to extricate yourself from that process. Make a demand. What is your demand? Because at this point, you have been taught wrong. Bernie Sanders, losing, slumped shoulders, walks away. He's been taught wrong. And what he's imparting to you is wrong. The fact that you have a majority support for all of these policies gives you leverage in the political space. Because what you could do is convert all of that potential energy of people who've been disaffected into active energy by saying, we assert this as our demand. You accept, you get our vote when you back our interests. And our interest is Medicare for all, for one. Now, if you have 10, 20, 30 million people behind you, and it becomes very clear that the Democratic Party will lose without getting your support, then the question becomes for them. Are you willing to tank it to a man that you say is going to end democracy itself? Or are you willing to appropriate those policies? If the Democratic Party says, yes, we're willing to tank it to Trump because we don't want to deal with you setting a new precedent of the back and forth between us. So yeah, we'll tank it to Trump. Then you have qualms, you have questions you need to answer. What does it mean for a representative government if a party is saying, no, we don't want to appropriate a policy with 88% support and 70% public support. We don't want to do that. What does that mean for any notion of a representative government when your party is not representing you, let alone America as a whole, and would rather play games and tank it to a maniac? That's not on us. We have public support. We have public majorities. And the fact that we have public majorities, every last lefty news network that turned tail and immediately backed Joe Biden should have been saying the exact same thing I'm saying. We're in the middle of a pandemic. How do you turn your back on America like this? Yes, it is a gamble. But by the same token, the person who's right in this instant is us. The person who does the numbers is us. And when we make that argument and we make that pitch very, very clear. Are you really willing to tank it all as opposed to appropriating a policy that would not just ameliorate the conditions of the hardest or the worst aspects of our society, meaning the people who Joe Biden wants to vote for him? It would also put that much more money in their pockets as their healthcare costs evaporate and they pay it in their taxes. This is not just a medical thing. This is also a financial thing. I'm making the point it is morally and ethically right, especially in the context of the time that we're in. And it is unacceptable for lefties to not take that position and to instead acquiesce to whatever the hell Democrat they put up, including Joe Biden and most likely to end up being Kamala Harris. You perpetuate your irrelevance. Honest to God. And when I say that, I don't say it derisively. I say it because it's flat fact true. They are sniffing tail of Republicans right now because they know you're captured. They're sniffing tail of Republicans, lifting up skirts right now because they understand that you, despite whatever they're doing, aren't going anywhere. They can do whatever they want. You're terrified of Trump. So Joe Biden can say, yeah, I'm not going to change the marijuana thing. Joe Biden could say, I'm not going to push through Medicare for all. Joe Biden could say, he could go through one item after the next that America wants and still say, kick rocks. And you, as a lefty, supposedly, head down, bowed, political equivalent of abused, battered wife, will still accept him and vote for him. I'm saying that's obscene. And the fact that you create your irrelevance in that way and perpetuate it that way is problematic and should not be something that is done. It's time for new politics. And that politics is to stand outside the political space and say, we are done. Till you get there, nothing happens. Until you get there, nothing changes. That is the place that you need to be. And right now is the perfect time to exist in that spot. You stand as an island in the sand and argue something that is true, by the way. It's his responsibility to get our vote. We are standing here for America to the tunes of millions, and we are being very clear. You will lose without our support. You were pushing, and Republicans push and get us. We're gettable, but you're not going to get us. Is the Democratic Party really willing to lose to a man that they consider to be the apocalypse, as opposed to organically forming and bringing your party together in a way by supporting Medicare for all and these policies that are extraordinarily popular within the context of population, are they really going to tank it to a man they consider the end of reality, as opposed to appropriate policies that the majority of Americans support? That's where you need to be. That's when you get change. Whether they lose or win, that position is where you get change. You're going to have all sorts of voter shamers and everybody else saying, oh God, you got to vote for this person. Nonsense. It is their responsibility to get our vote. It is a weird inversion of the process to even argue that it is us that is supposed to throw fealty and allegiance to Joe Biden. Nonsense! Do you realize how stupid that sounds? And the fact that you allow that level of inversion in your politics allows this race to the bottom in your political figures and allows that game to exist in the first place. At least worse. Your country has allowed poverty to persist for decades. The Democratic Party, supposedly the left-wing party that is supposed to deal with those things, didn't. They took a ton of cash and they told you blew no matter who. They took a ton of cash and did what you would think they would do in order to keep that cash, is organize a framework of mind and brain that organizes around that view of the world, that corporatist cash view of the world. And they moved to the right with policies that would allow them to fall in line, dovetail perfectly with that cash. Lefties had nowhere else to go, just like the guy said, had nowhere else to go. And they accepted whatever the Democrats did under this notion that they were utterly and entirely powerless. What does that mean, though? That means that regardless of what policies Democrats put up and what policies you put up, it's not going to matter. Your policies don't mean squat because you are fundamentally and entirely, utterly, completely, indubitably, to 1,000 measure, irrelevant. And you need to absorb that and understand what that means. Understand that, you have these networks that may bitch and moan, but at the end of the day, they still vote for Democrat, which means they are utterly and entirely irrelevant. You incentivize your own irrelevance by being that gettable. To slap you drunk with the legs open at any guy can pretty much take advantage of. I'm making the point, that's wrong. Drunk, take advantage of, that's rape. It's salacious, but I don't want to call it rape. You get my point. The moment that you say, I am willing to vote for something that I don't buy into, and you are, for decades, despite whether it's popular or not, for decades, are in a situation of, oh God, okay, I'll vote for this person. It creates a standard whereby this faction of the party, maybe a 1%, is able to basically control the entirety of the party by disregarding what the party wants and disregarding America itself. Both parties do it. In this very specific case, you even have people who vote and fight against their own interests. And instead of saying, no, you get our vote when you represent our interests, what are you talking about? All of these policies are popular. You need to implement this. Instead of going that, which would be factually true and completely right, they look at other people and say, you need to vote for our decrepit candidate. Because to some degree, they accept that that party is not going to do anything for them. They also accept that to some degree, the party has abdicated all responsibility and nothing that you do will get them to accept some level of a rational representative government. I'm saying it's backwards. I'm saying the very fact that you accept that, make that true. I'm saying it's either true or false entirely, depending on your point of view and acceptance. If all of those people who voter shame, if all of those Sam Cedars of the world, the TYTs of the world, stood out and said, you get our vote when you represent our interests. In fact, if they would have said that in 2016, they would have a lot more clout and leverage right now because they burned their reputations with Hillary Clinton's loss. Right now is the moment. Right now. I know you're dejected. I know you feel like, you're isolated or that nothing is further from the truth. If all of you stood outside of the political space and said, we're done, just in the same way that people do strikes when they get sick and tired and fed up with being exploited at work. You are being exploited by a political party. You are being guilt-tripped into backing particular policies that you don't particularly like. And on some level, I hope you realize that if you have Medicare for all with 88% support and you can't get that over the finish line, you can't get anything over the finish line ever. Think of why. Introspection for the moment. Why? You feel that it is your responsibility to keep America on its axis. And in order to do so, you must vote this other guy who you pretty much don't like. I'm saying the very point that you accept that makes that true. The truth of the matter is that the argument has been inverted because after primaries, you're taught to fall in line. I'm saying that what matters more are the policies. There's nobody who's falling in line that is representing the interests of Medicare for all that would substantially deal with the material concerns of the population. We need champions, not cowards. This is a situation where people need to grow up and realize that what I'm saying is true here. Step outside the political space. That is politics also. Politics is not the measure of everything that takes place from the standpoint of voting. It is also being outside of that space and asserting, this is what we want. This is our demand. All of these progressive groups out there representing all of these people should have been doing just that the moment that Sanders lost. Sanders should have been doing just that because at that point the policy matters more. And what you have is the mob. What you don't have is internal support within the Democratic Party. That mob, however, has the ability to make them lose. And that's where you should have went with this. You will lose this race if you don't support our policies. And ask, why are you so purist that you don't accept the policy that the American public has decided? Are you really going to take it all to a maniac by not appropriating the policies? That should have been the argumentation framework that happened immediately after the primary when Sanders tanked it. That should be the argument now. That should be the argument going forward. Combined with making the point that Joe Biden, he can lift as many Republican skirts as he wants. What the polling shows is that there are only like 4% of Republicans that he has that are gettable. Meaning you are willing to burn the base with almost a belief that they're going to be there regardless because they're terrified and the blacks are terrified, et cetera, et cetera. For 4% of Republicans. You realize they're also trying to get rid of you or have you replaceable. Their policies align better with Republicans at this point, or let's say 90s Republicans or 2000s. And so from their standpoint, you asking for Medicare for all, you pushing for this policy or that policy, it annoys them. It's annoying to them. So they're perfectly willing to try to get those voters and basically deal with their main issues to which they basically agree with in regards to corporatism, finance, militarism, in regards to issues of war, not necessarily raising the minimum wage, not necessarily dealing with poverty, none of that stuff. All that stuff is off the table. These guys want to talk about something else. They believe that you are so battered, so abused, that you will still stay. I believe they're probably right. If those people who believed in Medicare for all stopped dealing with the Democratic Party and left, you will get Medicare for all. Or the Democratic Party would be willing to tank it to ensure that you did. And all sorts of questions erupt from that. Who are you actually representing? Who are you actually pushing for if you're not necessarily pushing for the elements of your party that want X or Y? All of those things need to be dealt with. Not to mention the largest question of all is if you're not living in a representative government, what government are you living in? And how did you get to where you got to? Trump may be a concern, yes, but you have larger concerns if the Democratic Party is willing to do that. I'm going to say like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all. Pop reality. They answered that in a debate. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. In the debate, they're okay with Trump. Yeah, they were willing to tank it to Trump. Each and every one of them were willing to rip it out of the hands of Sanders. And that's something you need to internalize. If the Democratic Party is willing to tank it to Donald Trump in order to stop you, your policies, and Sanders from getting into the White House, but you are not willing to do that, how could you ever win? I hope you understand me. This is a game of chicken where the person is perfectly willing to go off the cliff. You are not. You will always lose that game of chicken. And when I say about game of chicken, I just mean if you say we want Medicare for all. They are willing to lose as opposed to appropriate the policy. Right now, they could say Medicare for all is the tip of the spear, in addition to Social Security and college debt. And what would happen is the same people who support the Democratic Party now will continue to do so, and a mass of younger voters and other people will swarm into the party with a huge show of enthusiasm. I'm telling you, as a flat fact, that would happen. They're not going to do that, despite the fact that that would be the way to ensure that Joe Biden wins this race. They're not going to do that because the people who pay them, their point of view of the world, the 75% of the time they spend begging for cash, would be against spending money in those things to ameliorate the material concerns. That's just true, right? And so, no, they're not going to push those policies. No, they're not going to pass those ideas. No, Joe Biden is not going to push for this or that, despite the fact that those would be things that would allow them to get elected. How they get their cash, how they function, how they operate is entirely against any notion of that level of expansive politics, despite the fact it would definitively deal with poverty concerns of the people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum and the people who Joe Biden goes screaming, King of Blacks, for votes from. Yeah. Agreed. All right, I'm going to end this here. Oh, wait, Jesus. The government needs the people's labor and not their money. The government needs the people to need the currency, and that's why it taxes the dollar. Well, the government at times need to take money out of the society. Meaning, like, look, we have screwed up this financial system, right? I mean, we basically have banks or a bank that have, in part, assumed the role of the greenback. Now, granted, the government can come in and take their power away at any particular moment and just start printing greenbacks, but it gives the fiscal policy and whatnot to the Treasury. We have to pay on that money, which is obscene, but we have to pay taxes on that money, or interest on that cash. Beyond that point, but beyond that point, the more important thing, though, is it's the government that's saying this money is legit and this money is okay. It's produced from us. If the government didn't create it, it would not be there. And so that's the basic point. The secondary point is, yeah, the government needs labor. Well, the society needs labor, not just the government. Keep in mind, the government, supposedly, philosophically, is just a bunch of people coming together and agreeing on a rule set to which we operate in. And as other people are born, they also operate within that rule set. But the rule set allows permutations and changes to the rule set. The problem is that human beings are what they are. And if you give a person the ability to get an advantage, despite the fact that they're screwing around with the rough edges of the rule set, they'll do it. And so the rule set gets almost like a cancerous aspect to it, just from the level and the way that people can get advantage. Meaning, if the rule set doesn't accommodate for a way to weed that out, then that would be a problem. Now, that grouping, that consensual set, is basically supposed to be us filling out and saying, what do our government, what do our world look like? How do we protect the government, A? How do we be sure that changes can be made to the rule set in order to more fair as we move through society, etc.? And you go for it from there. It's not a magic thing. It's more of a consensual document that people deify and turn into some kind of religious thing. As a society, we use the lens of government, supposedly, to ameliorate various rough edges, to allow us to live cohesively together. Again, ideally. That's not how it's typically used, because the people who are in power are part of a very small clique of people, the 0.1%, and they make rules for everybody else who suffer and work. Yes, they need our labor. They need all that stuff from us. Let me end this, but that's true. All right, I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe.